Okay, I've been hard at work speculating a stable resolution to a therapeutic outline, or I don't know how to phrase it. Essentially, I'm trying to find some kind of configuration within the false ego complex, uh, which comes to a reconciliation and a resolution of all the structures, and because all the structures are themselves a little bit unique, because the superego is the first thing to emerge, and it's let's say half of it is incomplete or nebulous, which allows for the whole false ego complex to develop. The subconscious is the first product of another side of the mind, in some sense. If you take either it's the first side of the mind or it's the second side of the mind, both are almost true, because it's the first new side of the mind, and in some sense it is the pet of the superego, which is itself unfinished. So it is the first whole side of the mind, and it is the first thing, the first manufactured good. But then it is also sort of, so it's in this very strange second and prime position, because, what did they say? First the worst, second the best. And so it really does think that it is the best thing ever, but that is sort of intrinsically linked to the nebulousness of the superego, and the subconscious itself is very toxic. And so it's so toxic that it's capable of creating its own new side of the mind when it doesn't like its own inferior function, and it can't deal with its own inferior function. So the subconscious, in the natural course of things, in the ordinary course of development in a child, develops, let's say, a naive narcissism, which then saves itself generally from stopping itself from becoming a malignant narcissism by jettisoning the inferior function and the sin of the subconscious to repurpose as the death and the lust of the unconscious side of the mind. And although the death doesn't have an approximation within MBTI, the lust is essentially the child function. So the inferior function becomes repurposed, and the lust and the sin becomes the lust of the unconscious side of the mind. Which so the unconscious side of the mind starts off with a starting position, um, an environmental conditioning and a child function, and then from that naturally emerges the colonization or development of the subsequent, or sorry, the proceeding cognitive function, which becomes the dominant function after the child, and then the parent function after the dominant function, and then a new inferior function. And the unconscious side of the mind is very hard for it to develop, because in some sense the subconscious won't let it go further into the ego. The subconscious is only allows the unconscious to exist for its own amelioration of wanting to distance itself from its toxic inferior function, which perhaps even is not completely, it hasn't completely divorced from its inferior function. Often what the subconscious will do is it will compartmentalize its inferior function. So to actually gain proper access in maturation and development of a normal, ordinary human being, which is what culture generally does, is it says, no, no, this is the law, this is the law, this is your role in life, actualize your role. Don't care about your beliefs. We don't care about your beliefs. Tell me what your role is. Tell me what you're doing here and now, because you're lost in your unconscious anyway. You're lost in karma. So work out a present time purpose. Work out something that you can be responsible for here and now, and make your role your new stable seat of consciousness. But people can't do that because their unconscious side of the mind doesn't even have full license. It doesn't have the keys to the kingdom, as it were, because the subconscious is still holding on to half of the ownership of the registration of the car, or something like that. So the subconscious never gave the car to the juvenile kid. The unconscious does not own its own mode of transportation, its vehicle. It's got a compartmentalized hold, right? Now this compartmentalization has to come to an end. And that has to be brokered, and it's quite painful in some sense, because the subconscious, when it gives up the keys to the kingdom to the unconscious, is essentially saying, do with me whatever. The subconscious is going to be relatively speaking maimed and dead, or left for dead, rather. That's a better phrase, left for dead. It's not going to be dead, but it's going to be left for dead. And the only way to safely leave it for dead is if you have something almost like a Noah's Ark. You have to kind of import all the important things of the subconscious and you have to duplicate them within the unconscious side of the mind, which actually proves that there is something of value in the subconscious to be extracted from. And so that replication process is hard, is incredibly hard. That even takes years. You even have to consciously, well, at least in my false ego complex, it took me, that was trial and error in some sense. And I did that over a long period of time with the conscious understanding that that's my aim of development, that I'm just trying to, um, now this is hard to do in some sense because, sorry, I shouldn't say that. This is a non-linear transference because some people will transfer different things to other people and it is purely to do with their metagram circuitry. But in some sense what you're doing is you're entrenching enough of your metagram circuitry, which is, let's say, because in the metagram circuitry is, I believe, in my current model, is exactly what the unconscious side of the mind is, but it's more complicated because there's a spooling problem, because there's a beginning of the unconscious and there's an end of the unconscious, like bookends, and then that's where there's a duplication on both sides. So there's a potential compartmentalization of spooling into the unconscious, and there's a potential compartmentalization of spooling out into the ego, because essentially things that are used in the unconscious side of the mind are repurposed anatomy. So the death and the lust of the unconscious is the trial and the sin of the subconscious. And the trial and the sin of the unconscious is the death and the lust of the ego. Now, obviously, one of those compartmentalizations is much more toxic than the other, and it's actually the subconscious one that's more toxic, which is why it's so important that that handoff be processed, or in some kind of procedural way, in some kind of directed developmental way, in some sense as well. When I say directed, I mean self-directed, because if you don't know that you're doing it, you can perhaps do a little bit of it unconsciously because you're following your culture, but if you don't do it in a self-directed way, then you're not going to really progress past Keegan stage 3, I would say. To use, I've never read his book, but I'm just using it as an approximate sort of rating. Anyway, so so then we have on the other side the other problem. Now, in some sense, I guess I don't, but both of those bookends that have the potential duplication, I would say the one bookend is something like narcissism, and the other bookend is something like borderline personality disorder. And then I think the other personality disorders are probably like cluster A and cluster C might correspond quite neatly with other forms of subtype, with tamasic subtypes within particular configurations of metagram circuitry. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that very complicated jumbling mess, and I don't have very hard and fast solutions to that, but I believe that inkling is probably very much spot on. But anyway, what was I talking about? Now, the unconscious side of the mind itself, I think you can almost naturally precipitate this kind of developmental line when you have enough juvenile friends. In some sense, a lot of the problems today is that people don't want to let go of the subconscious. They are incredibly narcissistic, as it were. They want a compartmentalized spool off into the unconscious side of the mind, and they don't even believe that the ego exists. And they have in fact been told by all their fake spiritual teachers that the ego is the source and the root of all evil, in some sense, that you need to homogenize your beliefs with the collective or something like that. It's very, very lowbrow, it's very, very tribalist, it's very, very disgusting, it's very, very proto-fascist, blah, blah, blah. And it's very prone to narrative inception, it's very prone to narrative takeover. Um, And in some sense, this makes people very easy to market to and to become consumerists, because essentially they can just be told that, oh yeah, this thing is the solution to the problem. You just need to, uh, um, so it's all about sort of this weird form of developmental acquisition of beliefs that you store up in a kind of material totemic sense. So we've kind of got a weird sort of totem driven symbolism, and sort of being on the right side of history, um, and looking the part or something. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling a bit too much, but how in the ordinary course of events, how juveniles would get over this is they would have juvenile associates, they'd have juvenile friends, they would have friends of their subconscious in some sense. And in some sense, this is the thing, you cannot really be truly friends with someone's subconscious because it is toxic as hell. And so, so all these people, eventually your beliefs get chided. Eventually your beliefs are seen to be contextually facile, because you can always, like, beliefs have no resolution. Beliefs are always wrong because you can always find a context to break them. The only way to actually sort of progress past decontextualization games or whatever is caring about something called good faith, charitable interpretation, as it were, which in some sense, the whole identity politics is completely antithetical to hearing anything other than something that reinforces the rightness of your own belief set. It's all about sets of belief. And Set was the great snake that in the Egyptian underworld or whatever, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, these are all just followers of Set. Essentially, these identity politics people. And I mean that, and this is why I just call them proto-fascists. They're no different between their worldview and the Nazi conceptualization of society and world and life. And they have the same types of mythologies, blood and soil. Just for them, it's history and oppression. You just displace blood and soil with history and oppression. It's the same bullshit, different window dressing. And they were just as toxic. Sorry, this is devolving into a bit of a thought catalog, but I did want to make these points as well. You see, like the Napoleonic corruption that I keep on complaining about in the legalistic sense, and how continental Europe was so fucked up. You understand that, for example, the problem, the defect with French culture is that their culture is premised on not on understanding uh, from the individual perspective. It's based on assimilation. You will be assimilated by their culture. If they do want new things, they do want new ideas, but they want them already teleported inside their own culture. If it's of value, it should be assimilated through the culture. The German political corruption, in some sense, and when I say political corruption, it's more of a legal corruption, of a legal structure, I can't really lay this at the fault of the politics, but in some sense it's to do with the structure of the state. The problem with the German system is that their legal system assimilates. They don't farm their own understanding. They don't generate in-house their own understanding. Look at the British system. It is actually superior. First of all, I do think that their structures are a bit too ephemeral, which is sad, because you can't duplicate the British system because it's almost an accident of history to some degree. But let me just say why the British system is better. The British system is better because they don't lord over their own people. In some sense, the only way to get a new idea into Britain is to have it duplicated by individual people that understand what it is this new idea is. And then on the individual level, the legal system, it will be argued into the legal system when there's a controversy. And then the common law will discover it, and it will develop the common law. And then, so because you have, basically in the British system, the individual is sovereign. But in the French system, the culture is sovereign, which is, in some sense, not entirely, because in some sense, the church is the state, and that's actually funny because that's legally also true. Like, you can't actually operate like every religious organization in France, I believe, is essentially becomes sort of deputized or whatever. But anyway, that's an interesting sort of thing. But you can just see then how this cultural assimilation thing, they're like the Borg. Resistance is futile. They don't want to understand unless it's already inside their culture. Okay, that's perhaps a bit of a strange thing, but and that's a premise that they can't break. The British system, you can't break the premise of the British system because it's bootstrapped and you can't go any lower than that in some sense, except if you go completely authoritarian and tyrannical, which is obviously going in the wrong direction. But in some sense, obviously it would be better if the British system could sort of structure and conserve itself a little bit better within a little bit more sort of. Anyway, I mean, look, yeah, so it's interesting because you could say that maybe there would be a way to save the French system or something like that. The German system, I do think, is just legally fundamentally problematic because they're making themselves have to assimilate, like their elites, their let's say intellectual elites have to assimilate what's going on around the world because their society can't produce their own legal structures. They have to look far afield and assimilate them. That's if the whole world did that, it would not be sustainable. It's almost parasitic. In the same way, the French have this kind of, in some sense, the French are a bit projective about it because they're like, well, why don't we already know about it if it's so important? Why doesn't someone come to speak about it to us in French? Why isn't it already inside of us if it was so great? And in some sense, the Germans are kind of looking outside their borders to duplicate things so that their elites can duplicate things so that their plebs can have the benefits of that efficiency in some sense. Whereas the French, the benefit is not in terms of efficiency, the benefit is in terms of self-esteem and pride. That everyone can have pride that the French project is going to win. It's almost like an Islamic form of cultural chauvinism in some sense. Whereas at least the German chauvinism is more balanced because it kind of, at least their elites would know that they need to have a kind of perpetual Cold War in order to keep on looking at, spying at people and working out how to take those interesting conflicts and synthesize them into an efficient formula that then they can offer to their plebs. So in some sense, the Germans are too good to their own people in terms of their leaders, are too sympathetic to the common person, which then doesn't get to organically. So the natural leadership within the people is actually very much captivated by this system because they are not organically empowered to discover their own common law. They are lorded over by a legislature that says this is the regulation, follow the regulation. The law is not organic in Germany. And in some strange way, the French culture is too organic that you have to naturalize. You have to naturalize. If it's not natural in the, so you have to homogenize. You can't sort of be, you can try to be a kind of an intellectual upstart, but you kind of have to assume the whole edifice already. You have to assume the whole project. You can't swim against that. If you try to swim against that, and there are people in French society who see the decadence of this, they see the conceit of this, they see the fundamental. Anyway, so I didn't explain this. I'm missing an edge to this that ties it together quite nicely. But essentially, um, I mean, in some sense, perhaps both Germany and France would look at Britain and say, it's disorder, it's disorder, it's completely disordered. But in some sense, the British will say, everything in its place and a place for everything within our system, and we're dealing with it. We're in the pursuit of, it's kind of it's I mean, I'm perhaps narrating it a bit too neatly to just to make a kind of motif or whatever. And in some sense, the problem with the British system is that it can go awry. The whole project can explode. The whole project because it has no guarantee. It has no sense of that it must survive, or that it must, I mean, the only thing that makes it survive is the individual who wishes it to continue. So in some sense, it's on a hope and a prayer. It's living on a hope and a prayer. Whereas there's a kind of inbuilt faith to the French system, and there's an inbuilt faith to the German system, and you cannot question that faith. So it's fundamental. That's what I call the Napoleonic corruption, this kind of automatic faith. Okay, that maybe that ties it together a bit nicely. But anyway, now it's interesting because, I mean, in some sense, I don't think that these things are accidents, that these sorts of things happened. I do think that the Napoleonic corruption is in the image of Napoleon himself. I think that continental Europe bears the influence, it bears the, and I mean, yes, you could say it's also a product of history. I mean, it just so happens that the French aristocracy at the time were incredibly stupid, corrupt, and undeserving of their station, you know. But sadly, there is something to nobility that the British was able to save in their culture, that somehow the lineage, the unbroken traditional lineage of Britain, which was somewhat upset. Okay, like, I mean, Britain wasn't completely untouched by history. Britain lost its role in the world after, essentially, I mean, it was said after World War II that Britain lost its role in the world. I actually think that in some sense the writing was kind of on the wall after the American Revolution. Because after the American Revolution, in some sense, I think that I might again have all the history fucked up, but in some sense, yeah. So this is quite embarrassing if I have this history backwards. But I think that that's why they sent all the prisoners to Australia to make a penal colony, because they were like, well, look, if we can't even keep our colony, maybe we don't know what justice is, and maybe all the people that are in our prison, they just need, you know, in a new land that they would be able to configure something, because that's what America is doing anyway. So let's make let's make, instead of holding people in prison, let's just go set them free in a new land, and they can come synthesize their own organic justice from the ground up or something like that, because that's what the American project is, and they took their freedom from King George. Um, because isn't that what's going to happen organically? So in some sense, Britain outsourced the problem because it was already taken out of their hands by the Americans. If you understand that there's a secret project of the divine right of kings is not just a luxury, is not just an accident. That kingship didn't just evolve out of nothing, it evolved out of necessity, and it actually does have a pro-social effect, that the sovereign and the commons are even inextricably linked, and there would be no stable use of the commons without a sovereign to undergird and protect its integrity. Anyway, so all these concepts do need to be devolved. I mean, that was the whole point of sovereignty, is to grow nobility. That's why peers would grow, the peerage would grow. People would be ennobled. Um, this was essentially because Christendom wasn't just a corrupt political power system. It also had real believers behind it. And do you know how hard it was to be a king when there were 5 kings in England, and there were 5 kingdoms, and there were Norman invasions, and there were other invasions, and there were Gothic invaders, and I don't really know what I'm talking about, but you can see the class of things that I'm talking about. It was very tough to be a king. You could be killed by one of your noblemen because a king was just slightly richer than some other nobleman, especially before the canons existed. Before the canons, being a king was more of a liability. It was much better just to be a rich nobleman. You had much more power, and you could play politics, and you could play against the king in the shadows. Um, and there were often noblemen that were richer than the king. And in some sense, the king was the fall guy, because if you had a political invasion, they would decapitate the king to take the throne. If there, like, to be the king was all these risks and extra duties and responsibilities, and you still had to kind of keep your own estate and your own purse functioning. I mean, it was more trouble than it was worth, and in some sense, it was a great sacrifice to become the king because you've just literally potentially put your head on the chopping block to do what? To try to maximize the good for the people that you're doing, and in some sense, there's the problem is that the peasants can be revolting as well, and I mean that in the moral sense. Maybe they don't deserve the quality of kingship. Maybe they can't appreciate and have gratitude for the quality of kingship that they have. And maybe that's no fault of the king. Maybe that's the fault of the old king that was corrupted or whatever. So, this whole thing is a mess, but everything is a mess. Lower your standards, please. This is humanity. It's complicated. And, um, and the British have done a pretty good job at inventing and perfecting civilization that is worthy up to the, let's say, the integrated standards of keeping the flame alive, the flame that would be more alive if the Russian Revolution never happened, because the Russian aristocracy was actually probably the most advanced in terms of civilization. I mean, Moscow was literally the cradle of Europe. It was the heart of Western civilization was Moscow. We don't still yet understand the cultural loss. We lost the heart. We lost the beating heart of the West in the Russian Revolution. People don't even know this in history. But anyway, Romanticism was completely invented in Russia. It was mimicked and copied in Western Europe. Anyway, although there is something to the development of the British that did keep it, let's say, in the middle of society, which is somewhat perhaps exemplified by Cromwell and such and such. Anyway, let me move on. I was going to get into a bit of a rant and talk about the Jungian prophecy of the drowning king in the pool in the underworld. That who shall ever save the drowning sovereign, the drowning king, he will place into his right hand the morning star. And was it and eternal life? I'll play into his right hand eternal life and the morning star. But anyway, what I was going to talk about in terms of the sovereign and the king is what is often not spoken about is the fool. There are ways in which the court jester is de facto the king of the land, because foolishness is, let's say, the shadow of sovereignty. And how did the drowning king get into a pool in the underworld? Maybe not his own foolishness, maybe other people's foolishnesses. There's a way in which the state of the fool, the condition of the fool, makes a fool out of the sovereign. And to some degree, you can say that that was perhaps the problem with Maria Antoinette, is that her court jester didn't educate the aristocracy in France well enough, or they weren't interested, they were too distracted by, what do they call them? Social powders, drugs, essentially. Um, they were too decadent and extravagant and distracted to be educated as is usually the case in perhaps that form of even. I mean, European aristocracy has always been a bit substandard. The I shouldn't paint too broad a brush, because there are some aristocratic houses that were certainly, I think, deserving of the name noble, and in some sense life was much harder for the aristocracy of Western Europe, because they had to treat their royal families like cattle, like chattel. I mean, they were marrying each other. That never happened in the Russian Empire. Um, in Tsarist Russia, people only married for love, and which you were capable of doing because you had 1,000 princes and princesses in Russian aristocracy. Um, and the emperor quite insightfully expanded the ranks of the peerage, um, by imperial mandate, or whatever the legislature was called. He created a class of 1,000 princes and princesses, so that they had a big enough population that it was capable that you could find someone to marry for love. That wasn't possible in Western Europe aristocratic circles. Everyone, it was all a marriage of convenience, essentially, and a convenience for national politics. Anyway, I don't. I mean, which is in some sense you could say, well, the fools could not educate their aristocracy about love and romance because perhaps it was too much of a sore point for those people. So those people were already sort of cut off from their own sense of self, other than perhaps raw carnal lust on the side, because obviously a king or a prince, could probably have as many chambermaids as they so wished, or whatever the hell. Um, so, I think that there was an endemic cultural degeneration that happened from which Western Europe was somewhat always prone to. But I mean, I shouldn't paint too much of a broad brush, because there were certainly pockets of aristocrats that were the salt of the earth, I would say. Because, there's so much interesting history in continental Europe in terms of the wars, in terms of how people, it's interesting how suffering and wisdom grow together. And, I mean, how the Dutch invented and essentially broke the mold of mercantile capitalism while they were a colony of Spain or something. I can't remember who they were a colony of. You know, because everyone wanted Dutch money, and there wasn't enough of it because they didn't have enough gold. Because if you didn't have Dutch money, you couldn't buy spices. Um, they had to use tulips as money. It was sort of crazy. Um, Tulip bulbs or something. But anyway, you see how the sort of the fool and the sovereign sort of, and this is the question of sustainability again. I think that this is another manifestation of this perennial trade-off between sympathy and sustainability. Is that sometimes structures, they only work with some modicum of sympathy attached to them, which kind of gets ingrained and enculturated into the people. But when that stops becoming a conscious sacrifice and it starts becoming taken for granted, then you get this very kind of toxic ideological overreach, and you get this kind of self debasement and delusion, sort of delusional sort of projection, which you can see sort of mirrored back to you on every reflective surface that you come across, and it creates this very strange escalation of entrenched madness and sort of false belief structures, and you end up living in a very confected narrative that is so poisonous. And this happens all over the place. And anyway, when I talk about my sort of my fivefold way of dealing with this, is the three negative values that we need to get to grips with, and the two fake positive values that we need to question and leave no stone unturned. The three negative values being untruthfulness, uncarefulness, and seriousness, and the two fake positive values being kindness and positivity. And that is not to say that you cannot be positive and that you cannot be kind, but when you, let's say, demand that people need to be positive enough that they are also kind, or kind enough that they are also positive in their kindness, then you are perhaps demanding a kind of sympathy extraction, which is going to develop the kind of projection that I just spoke about. But also, each of the negative values needs a bit of a primer, which I put in another recording. But anyway, okay, I went down this whole rabbit hole because I just wanted to kind of pontificate a bit about the complexity of the sovereign individual. And I went into that because I was talking about Britain in contradistinction to France and Germany in terms of its the that there are some forms of assimilation which are toxic, which have a kind of sympathy built into them, kind of a sympathy extraction built into them. And in Britain, I do think that in some sense they actually expect to be led by individuals and individual understandings that have duplicated for themselves as individuals in yourself as a way to lead the culture forward. So in some sense, the culture and the legal structure in Britain is led by something like the sovereign nobility of the individual that allows them to discover the common law. Now, it's not exactly true in Britain, because in some sense then the people have to use the ballot box, their first past the post ballot box, to make sure that their interests are defended in the parliament, because the parliament in Britain is sovereign, is the sovereign seat of power. And so the people are only collectively sovereign, not as individuals. So to me, that is the defect in the British system, which I believe is actually fixed within my legal tradition, although my legal tradition stands betrayed by corrupted jurisprudence and corrupted politics that led to the corrupted jurisprudence, which gave the judges a perverse incentive to follow the bad example of foreign countries, to follow the bad American legal scholars' advice, to believe that our system is anything like the American system, when our system is so much superior in its legal structure to the American system. We actually do have space for the sovereign individual, and we do have a supreme constitution which delineates how these structures work, but they have all been misinterpreted on purpose. The value of the Supreme Constitution has been betrayed in order to lean into this identity politics, because it's politically convenient to do so, because it facilitates corruption, it facilitates theft, essentially. And then it facilitates a way to disguise that theft as, let's say, ideologically necessary, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so let me move on. Well, is that everything that I mean, I was talking at the beginning about developmental things. I was talking about narcissism. And I just would like to link that then, so the narcissism of assimilation into beliefs is a good way of what I would describe as, let's say, I mean, I haven't read Keegan's book, but they talk about Keegan stage 4.5, which in some sense I might call that 3.5. And they talk about, and I think borderline personality disorder is Keegan stage, what Keegan would perhaps describe as borderline 4 point, as Keegan stage 4.5. Although I think that 3.5 is kind of like the ideological version of the individual. So the individual might be at Keegan stage 4.5, but they end up creating an ideological matrix, which is what I would call 3.5. And the people that slot into that ideological matrix are people that are narcissistic, that I would say are at 2.5. So you get sort of the junior pseudo-intellectual narcissists, which I have sometimes called cerebral histrionics. And I've got long talks about cerebral histrionics. And these are people like Rationality Rules. These are people like Destiny. Both of those people are YouTubers. One of them is Destiny is a social justice identitarian proto-fascist, and Rationality Rules is a kind of has much the same kind of structure of belief, but he does so under the rubric of scientism, essentially. So, but I mean, obviously, he doesn't believe in, or I don't know what, I mean, I think he is actually a little bit partial to identity politics, or he has given positive comments about it, but in some sense, it's just that's because it's in style, it's similar to his form of pseudo intellectualism around objective morality, or whatever he wants to call his stupid field. But I mean, that's the profanity of the subconscious, that it thinks it's appertaining or attaining to anything that's potentially even slightly objective. There's nothing objective about it, but they rely on the idea that they're attaining to some kind of objective paradigm. Um, this is let's say, the toxicity of narcissism in a nutshell. Um, on the other end, on the borderline side of things, it's actually much more insidious. It's much more pernicious because, in some sense, they know it's all a game at the end of the day. In some sense, they're almost fundamentally nihilistic, where they're like, this is the only game that's worth playing. This is the only game that I find fun. They're like unilateral directors. They just want to get a soapbox underneath their feet and a loudspeaker and then bark at everyone that doesn't do what they want them to do. And in some sense, on some level, everyone can be said to be doing this. So this is the ironic thing about these identity politics proto-fascists that actually loudspeaker this, is that they tell people, this is what you're doing, this is what you're doing. I'm defining what you're doing because we all get to define what everyone else is doing according to our own opinions. But my thing should be more canonical because I've been oppressed and you are the oppressor class. So now you have to listen to me. We need to reverse the role. I need to become the colonizer to recolonize what has been decolonized. When you took over this bubble which belonged to me in history and in morality, or something like that. So they have a kind of, they attest to this weird kind of objective morality, as they even undermine objective morality as a category because they're kind of epistemological pluralists. So it's like they have this kind of forked tongue. And it's just, the whole thing is just a stream of narrative that you're not allowed to do anything other than agree with it. They just basically want to blare you out of existence. They want to blare any disagreement out in the airwaves, that you cannot hear anything else. It's the itching ears scripture, as it were. Um, Now, this is much more nuanced than what I just said, because they don't just do that. They also play cat and mouse. They also play, I throw a stick or a stone at you, and then I run away. And then as you're trying to come and get me, I've dug holes and covered up the holes with coverings so that you can't see them, so that you fall into a trap. There's all sorts of trickery like that, because these are people that are playing the long game, and they just want the whole society to be prone to their kind of extortionism, their kind of sadistically edged emotional extraction. These are vampires. Borderline personality disordered people are essentially kind of social vampires, and they will be one of the puppets of their own narratives. They will cry. They will have makeup running down their face as they go to the policeman and say, "Mr. Policeman, I've just been raped." Like, this is not new. Women have this ability to socially manipulate and cajole. I mean, this is why famously in Islam, a woman's word is not enough. You need at least 3 or 5 witnesses to corroborate if they're all going to be women, or something like that. Because then, at least then, if you can catch one of them is lying because they essentially just try to concoct the story and then they had four of their friends to agree with them, then at least then you can lock them all up for perjury or something like that. At least you can punish them all for perjury if you can prove that essentially that the whole thing was essentially a self-deluded narrative in some sense. Now, should I get into why this is the case? I mean, get into the asymmetries between the sexes and things like that. I mean, a lot of these asymmetries need to be understood. Um, I mean, I'm not happy that I mean, these facts, in some sense, do not, they don't bring me any joy, and I do think that they are more to do with culture than they are to do with necessity, or there is a biological substrate to this. In some sense, women and men are not exactly cut from the exact same cloth in terms of the kinds of asymmetries. I mean, we need actually a very high level of culture to bring the sexes together in a stably healthy way. And we don't have that cultural technology developed yet. In some sense, we live in the reemergence of the matriarchy, as far as I can tell. I mean, as far as I can tell, fascist Nazi Germany was not a patriarchy, it was a matriarchy. It was culturally led by women. Women made fascism popular in Weimar Germany. Women led the movement on the cultural front. It was a completely women-dominated social apparatus. I mean, people forget this. Um, I don't know if I have the energy to unpack all of this in a way in which someone would actually listen through it. Uh, Let me just think if I can find some sort of balancing quality here. But in some sense, let me just harken back to the French example. I think it is telling that the monarch at the time of the French Revolution, Maria Antoinette, it was telling that it was a woman. Why was it probably a woman that led to the downfall of the French aristocracy and not a man? Because probably the court jester, who knows, maybe he was the person who fucked it all up. He was the person who couldn't educate Maria Antoinette as it is the proper purpose of the fool to do, is to educate the monarch with some sort of educational line through the humor. But maybe some women just aren't interested in humor because they don't need to be that sensitive to everything. They just need to pick something that they're good at and gain access to high status that way in some sense. Like men, I almost feel in their body their own need to prove themselves, um, because most males in our ancestry, um, okay, that's an oxymoronical statement for what I want to say, but most men throughout history have not left their genes behind. They have not successfully procreated. Most men die out in every generation. It's been very different maybe these last 300 years or so. But men, if you wanted to choose to be a man or a woman in any time and you wanted to have a better life, like generally speaking, if you lived in a society in which things were already, the average of the society was healthy, let's just say that the average experience of the average individual in the society was more positive than negative, if you averaged it out or something like that, per person, you would want to be a woman. You would always want to be a woman if you just cared about creature comforts and you cared about passing on your genes. If you just cared about the evolutionary drive, you would always just want to be a woman. Like, in some sense, you are flipping the coin. I guess, because, like, not all women are as pretty as other women. And so, like, if you just happen to fit the fad and the fashion of your time, but also men have very fucking varied tastes. There's a man that's interested. There's a man that's after that kind of quality, and to tell you the truth, a lot of that is almost accidental. Men like what they see, and they see what they see as they grow up, so they enculturate themselves to what's available. Men develop experiences because maybe when they were growing up, a woman who was three times his age, you're 5 years old, a woman that was 15 walked up to him and he gave her a flower and she said thank you, or he had a friendly exchange with a woman who was three. You're a 5-year-old boy and you're talking to a 15-year-old girl, because that's what happens in a community. People interact with one another, and you see things and you have chance encounters, and somehow, oh, the girl with dark brown hair, oh, I like girls with dark brown hair, I had a good experience. What you see is what you potentially like if you have good experiences. So, this is how boys develop their sexuality eventually. This is how it's compiled. Generally speaking, people get a sense they get a symbolic reduction of what things mean, of what traits mean. Oh, if a woman looks like this, then she's probably one of those women, because in my experience, that's the reduction. That's the generalization. And then you also learn that your own generalizations are faulty. That at some point you grow up and you say, well, I know these two people, they look so similar, and the one I like and the one I dislike. So I have to be careful that I can't just associate this trait with liking or disliking. That's irresponsible. This is how people grow. This is how people develop. This is how they mature. And sexuality, to a large extent, a lot of it is unconscious. Um, and also a lot of it is aggregated. That you work out that actually, in my experience, everyone with this trait has always been negative. So I'm not going to give that trait another interest. And maybe some people judge with their own eyes, and some people judge with the eyes of their peers. And then you get cliques. You get cliques of association and assumption. Now, women, in some sense, are more prone to algorithmic thinking than men are. And that's just a biological fact, I'm sorry, but it happens to be biologically true. And that's, I would say, because men have testosterone and women have less testosterone in general, especially growing up, especially in young infancy. So boys will have more energy, generally speaking, to go and experiment and discover knowledge themselves. Women, in some sense, like listening to stories. They like analyzing. They like playing with dolls and mocking up interpersonal relationships. They like learning about the dynamics between people, and they learn from people, whereas boys can learn by their own hands on, experimenting, engaging themselves. And then it's not as if some girls don't also do that. We used to have a word for them. We used to call them tomboys. Now we call them transgender in the making, I guess, or some bullshit like that. There used to be a whole variety of experiential manifestation of the gender, because in some sense gender is in the spiritual sense, I'm what I would call, in the alchemical tradition, it's called hermetic alchemy. Um, Sorry, I'm doubting my own terminology here. But yeah, Hermeticism is about the spiritual understanding that you are a male spirit and a female soul. That the voice in your head is essentially male. Now, you see, because gender is not the same thing as sex. Anyway, so the sexual expression and manifestation of gender is, let's say, an embodied social conventional blah blah blah. Anyway, but we also have to understand that biologically there are going to be generalizations which generally hold true, which and in some sense there's no reason to plague people with generalizations. You shouldn't you shouldn't say that no, you can't be this job because you're a woman. You should say no, you can't be this job because you can't complete the obstacle course. Your lung capacity is lower, your strength is lower. So no, you shouldn't be a fireman because you're going to die of smoke inhalation. If you are in a big fire, a big man with big lungs is not going to be overcome by smoke inhalation, but you will. And by the way, I know of people, I know of women female fighters who were feminists who died. They didn't even fucking die to big fires. They didn't even die to medium fires. They died to small fires from smoke inhalation. 50 years of feminism, thank you very much. Yeah, you people, you're heroes. All of you feminist miscreants. You're all fucking heroes. But then at least then now women are also dying for your ideological decadence. Because before it was just men that were sent. Men that were sent to war. Men that were sent... Because you know what's behind the patriarchy? It's the fucking matriarchy. It always has been. Because women just want to have their cake and eat it. Men throughout history have always just wanted a fair deal. That has been the overarching thing of men. That's why we leave women out of politics, so that we can order our houses into a fairer deal. Because women, when they get involved in politics, they're not looking for a fair deal. They're looking for raw chauvinism. They're looking for high status. They're looking to advance their own interest. And they don't have a sense of humor enough to be sensitive enough to the problems of other people, because this is the asymmetry between the sexes, and it's sad, but it's true, is that you could say biologically it's more important for a woman to procreate at a younger age. Biologically, it's more important that a woman settle down, and she probably settled down with someone who's older than her, because then she's winning in terms of when you combine your estate with somebody else and somebody else is older than you, you're basically getting 3 years of capital investment. You're getting free... if you marry someone that's 10 years older than you, let's say you're 25 and he's 35, right? And now you're going to combine your estates into a joint estate. Who is gaining there? He is gaining access to biological fitness that is going to make healthy offspring and pass on his genes. And she is gaining access to 10 extra years of sweat and toil and experimentation. And she's only chosen him. Why? Because he's got he's got some good physical attributes, hopefully, as well, but that he is well established. He's got a house, or he's got provisioning. He's got some kind, he can provide. Because women need provisions to have a healthy, successful family. They are vulnerable during pregnancy, and they're vulnerable when they have a young infant. It's a biological imperative that they are looking for fitness, that they are looking for social status, they are looking... And in some sense, this is the disgusting thing in our... Well, it's not that this is the sad truth of our society, that there is nothing more despicable to a woman than a man with a rich spirit and a poor bank account. Because what can she do with that? What can a woman do with a man with a rich spirit and a poor bank account? She can't start a family with him. And this is the problem, is that in some sense there used to be a middle road. There used to be that, okay, well, you find each other at university, maybe. You find each other growing up with one another. You find it's your next door neighborhood sweetheart. It's your high school sweetheart. And you start a life together. And she actually bets on him or something like that. And they both sacrifice together, and they both build a life together. And there was actually there was a community there. That doesn't, in some sense, the whole feminist thing is I want it all. Uh, I want it all, and I end up with nothing, and then I blame society for systemically oppressing me, for not delivering to me what I expect that I felt entitled to. Do you see how many sort of projective mirror images there are in that kind of ideological confection? I mean, if you want to criticize men, the first thing you better fucking do is be grateful at all the disposable male energy that has existed in our lineage. I mean, do you know how we made the world safe for human beings? By killing non human beings with men that died, to kill the Neanderthals, to kill the other hominid species. Because when we clashed with the other hominid species, we took casualties in the form of men, not in the form of women. So we outbred them. Men and women together, we killed the other hominid species. We wiped them out. We dominated this planet because of the specialization between men and women. It was a winning strategy. And in some sense, then we also used it against ourselves in terms of tribalism, because in some sense, we kept our women safe, we kept them healthy, we kept them well fed. And as long as our culture was structured intelligently enough that technologically the men could keep up with the technological advancements of the other societies, that essentially we needed numbers and we needed proficiency to not get taken over in kind of political clashes. Anyway, a bit of a warring sort of thing, and in some sense, a bit of that aggression has to do with this specialization between men and women, because in some sense, our own enemy is at our doorstep, because women have been an agitator for development for a very long time. Because women just feel entitled to things, and then that becomes a cultural convention, and then men just have to work out how to perform at that level. So in some sense, we have been developed positively, even by borderline personality disorder, because by having to cope with borderline personality disorder has kept society structurally. We've had to outpace borderline personality disorder by just giving it what it demands. So by having to, and sadly though, I mean, this has a cost attached to it, because then essentially if you don't find a way to control borderline personality disorder, eventually you end up creating enough male psychopaths and sociopaths because their mothers fucked them up royally. People forget that every time there's a monster of a man, uh, there's somewhat a monster of a mother behind that man. We kind of forget about that because we don't understand that abuse is not just physical abuse. Abuse is how a woman treats a father in front of the child. And abuse, for a sensitive child is the dysfunction in the role models, is a dysfunction in education, in pedagogy. Um, Obviously, physical abuse is also not helpful, but I'm just saying that there are other much more subtle forms of abuse. Um, and sadly, a lot of this is all entrenched into unchecked female privilege, to put it bluntly, that essentially, women cannot be questioned. So gender-based violence is put at the feet of men, and you are just not allowed to put it at the feet of women. I think we know enough that men can be perpetrators. I think we've known that for over 1,000 years. I think we've had social conventions that have said this is men step over the line. I think it even in medieval ages, the feminist historians have been lying for a long time. You think that men were not whipped for what they did to their wives and such. Men were always under the social gaze of if they overstepped the mark or whatever, or how they dealt with women. Um, in some sense, what there has never been any. How does a woman get dealt with when she is unsustainably, let's say, I mean, because in some sense, well, I mean, you could say that maybe it's a problem of the legal structure to some degree as well. But what about a woman who just does not want to be healthy or to keep herself in a good enough condition? You know, I mean, a lot of women, they are almost, they're sort of like borderline parasitic. I mean that with a hyphen. They are parasitic and they are borderline. They need drama. They need melodrama around them just so that they can see their own sense of self, because they can only know themselves through the directions that they can kind of inject into other people's lives. I mean, borderline is a very insidious form of personality disorder. Um, and in some sense, I think it is, even in our own cultural experience, we can know today that it was first the dehumanization of male sexuality. It was feminism in high school that tried to take out all of its grievances on boys developing in high school that just maybe wanted to have a normal kind of sexual environment or something like that. I'm talking somewhat vaguely or whatever, but the withholding of the malicious and sadistic ideological puppeteering of, okay, well, your women are only going to give you the time of day if you essentially say that your whole sex is evil or something like that. You know, this weird and you know, there are lots of boys who are intellectual enough that they can kind of cotton on to that bullshit like Destiny, and there are other boys that essentially aren't going to play that self-denigrating game because their personality style is such that they can't force themselves to speak such a self refuting, you know, kind of poisonous, you know, sort of ideology, which in some sense, if you step into, the only way that you can even survive is if you very quickly double it up into a kind of weird, kind of generalized societal thing that, oh, it's not men, it's actually capitalism. It's capitalism that corrupted men, so we just need to kill the rich people. You know, it's always just passing the buck forward or something. But because of, let's say, the removal of a sexual outlet between men and women, and a kind of ideological gatekeeping on sexuality, then you created this whole ideological fascistic gauntlet that you could try to model a Führer principle, a savior for the system, a savior against the systemic oppression, is all based on a doubling down of the dehumanization of boys and men's sexuality, of an intrinsic disrespect that women can choose who they want to have sex with, but men cannot have their chosen preferences. Their chosen preferences are all poisonous, political, personal, the politics of personal politics and sexual politics. So men must be restricted in their sexual politics, but women must be liberated in their sexual politics. I mean, this is asymmetrical warfare of an ideological sort that is so insanely toxic that it's crazy that women would even think that this thing. I mean, on a thematic level, how do they even buy into this? Well, it's because women will buy into anything because they're not used to people saying, that was a stupid thing to say. You should think twice before you say stupid things like that. Women don't get to hear shit like that. Men hear shit like that all the fucking time. That's how they grow a character and they mature and they develop their intellect. Women just get validation all the time. And that's what they expect to get as well. And that's what they demand when they don't get it. And then the whole system starts again. But in some sense, that's because women, you could say, want to keep their options open. They don't want to be put into a blunt contract. They don't want to be cornered. They want to keep their options open because they still want to look out for the highest bidder, because essentially it's a bit of a casino. You know, like they might still go to college. They might go to a club and get picked up by a celebrity. They might get swept off their feet by Prince Charming, who actually does have $1 million in the bank. You see, this is the problem that women have with hypergamy. In some sense, they can't even choose a man unless they have at least 4 or 5 suitors at the same time, because then they can know that they're saying, oh, actually, I do think that this guy is better than those 4 other guys. Or actually, how sure am I? I don't know. So, you know, this is the problem with women, is that they have a glut of choice, And in some sense, it has been men who have always been willing to put themselves available to give them that choice, so that essentially, so that they can hope to be chosen, because they don't want to not be chosen. And women, so like women can have five suitors at the same time. Men and boys, they're supposed to be one track guys. They can't, so there's all these weird sort of asymmetrical conventions that are disgustingly and ironically built into even the identity politics feminist bullshit. I mean, the whole thing is completely unsound. It's completely hypocritical. And to some degree, the only way that you ever overcome any of this stuff is if you are conscious enough of it that you put the game aside to some degree. You actually have to negotiate directly between two people. I mean, I have this is what I was trying to get into in my last recording when I talked about how to hack the system, because if you do have to hack it, you do have to undercut it, because otherwise you're not going to be able to have an authentic relationship. Um, this is what I was trying to get into when I was saying, in some, and I know that this is a gross oversimplification, and I even explained why it doesn't hold true in every circumstance, but people have to leave no stone unturned, and the people that leave no stone unturned are the people that are, or the people that don't want to leave any stone unturned, or the people that you can grow and mature with, and you can have a sexual relationship with, or develop your sexuality in connection there too. Um, and that doesn't even require sex. That can just be friendship. Being friends with the opposite sex. Where you are essentially creating a pseudo emotional connection and a pseudo emotional relationship. And uh, anyway, what was the point that I wanted to get in here? Was the point that I was trying to get to was that yeah. Well, anyway, I mean, a lot of these people are just fundamentally broken, I would say, in this upcoming generation. Or I mean, maybe some of the Zoomers have fixed it to some degree, but I don't know how to. But essentially, I think the people that are probably right now that are sort of 17 to 28, even, I think that whole generation is so sexually dysfunctional. It's crazy. Um, they have this weird kind of sadistically edged asexualism. They are both asexual, but they are incredibly predatory on this kind of ideological vector. Um, and they have no embodied connection to their, they almost have a death drive. They are proto fascists. I do think that these are going to be very, very dangerous people in the future. They're going to be a dysfunctional generation. I don't think they're going to be very, very poisonous to every sector of society. Um, these are like the boomers in some sense. I think in the same way that the boomers had this disgusting narcissism attached to them because they were all the only children of the great generation. Um, I think we've got a but hopefully we'll kind of keep them in check. I hope that we can kind of cordon them off as a cultural showcase as how people can be broken, and it's very hard to deprogram them. I think one of the best ways to understand how to deprogram them is if you watch Jordan Peterson's lecture on on when he's talking about ideological possession, and he's talking about um, the Gulag Archipelago and its author. I don't want to say his name because I'm so bad at pronouncing it. Solzhenitsyn. I can't say his name. I don't know the name properly. Um, that author, um, and he goes through essentially how people that were party loyalists that got thrown into the gulags, how they were so ideologically possessed that they still had to be on the right side and they still had to rationalize what the party was doing. This is exactly, if you just watch that whole, it's like an hour and a half lecture, I think, by Jordan Peterson. I'll put it maybe in the link of this recording. I put it in the link of my last video as well. I put it in the comments, not in the description bar. Anyway, it's got, I'm sort of, a lot of the time, I'm sort of retracing some of those themes in what I spoke about now. But anyway, it's all about how personality is affected by politics and ideology and rationalism and stuff like that. And he talks about he talks about the poetry of Milton and such. Anyway, let me move on. Man, okay, let me just move on two subjects ahead. Because I didn't even get to the point of the recording that I wanted to get to, which is that I think that I have now perfected the treatment of the false ego complex, and I think that this is the solution. The solution is the ego and the superego are very, very important. And I was having lots of problems. In my last recording, I was speculating that, the subconscious is fundamentally problematic. So, how do you deal with its toxicity? Um, okay, so the subconscious is fundamentally toxic, but it can't be jettisoned. It can't be categorically uh, cut off. It has to be discharged. It has to sort of be bled dry of its charge, of its pent up toxicity. Kind of needs to be unraveled so that it can get into a state of rest and a state of calm, perhaps. And that what will happen, therefore, is then the unconscious side of the mind will kind of be able to have an open, reflexive integration with it. So, in some sense, it'll kind of be the kind of a vestigial um, accessory to the unconscious side of the mind, but in some sense, all of its active juice will kind of be already present within the unconscious side of the mind. So it's just a kind of like a kind of an innate bookshelf, but that those books have already been programmed into the matrix of the unconscious side of the mind with its so-called golden circuit. With your metagram antennae is now a golden circuit um, that has a library attached to it. And sometimes you'll add to that library. You'll work out that these two subjects actually need to have a corresponding book, hybridized book concocted out of the combination of those two subjects. So maybe you'll add to your subconscious, but you kind of maybe that will be kind of what the subconscious will be, or it'll just be kind of static, and you will have enough categories in your subconscious that all the combinations will exist as sort of contextualized notional unconscious data, which in some sense won't be unconscious anymore, but in some sense it's not yours. It's embedded in your operations within the field circuits or something like that. So there's a lot of, let's say, contextual information which you don't have as an individual, but as part of, let's say, a part of a collective endeavor, which is in some sense grounded in the ego and grounded in grounding your good faith that is seen in the context of your ego. Anyway, I'm talking slightly mystically, but anyway, so because I don't want to talk about that side, I want to talk about because I think I did already kind of outline those sorts of issues in the last recording, but I think the full resolution that I've come to understand now is that I believe that the superego, how to stabilize the problem becomes the superego, because you see the superego becomes like you have to remove the nebulousness of the superego, but you also can be consumed by the superego perspective, because if you become the superego, it's like becoming the god of the world. It's you become a kind of the brain in the vat, the Descartes thought experiment of the brain in the vat. You become the demon if you see yourself as the superego. So it's how I think that you do need to make some kind of integration with the superego. And so how I think that works is how Nidhogg does not eat the roots of the world tree or the tree of life. So I do think the world tree might actually be the tree of life. That essentially this is the integration of the Son of Man, I think, is that you have to develop the vanity of the superego, but it won't be a vanity. It will be the New Jerusalem because it won't have a lust. So you create a city in the superego, but you do not create the child function, or you do not develop. So in some sense, what you're doing is you're crucifying the ego in order to discharge the toxicity of the subconscious, and you will keep on crucifying the ego in order to alleviate the charge of the subconscious. Now, this is going to be a bit complicated because I'm going to put layers onto this. I think that when you crucify the ego and you gain access to the superego, that is also what gives you some potential for aberrant salience, because you're not perhaps crucifying yourself enough, because crucifixion is very delicate, it's very precise, it's very nuanced. So if you don't in some sense, I think I was even crucifying myself well enough, but because I didn't know what I was doing in the superego, I was getting a little bit of aberrant salience. And I think that the reason why aberrant salience occurs is because the superego becomes like an empty hall that echoes, and then when you echo within the superego, the subconscious ends up whatever content of the subconscious isn't being crucified ends up sort of resonating in those echoes against itself, and you get a kind of and that's what aberrant salience is. I'm describing this so poorly. I'll just let me start again. So in the ordinary course of the crucifixion, you would crucify yourself in order to remove the nebulousness of the superego, because it's the nebulousness of the superego that protects the toxic subconscious structures. And the crucifixion means that you are burdening the responsibility of your own toxic subcultures. But if you don't burden those consequences in yourself, in your own body, in order to stop the cycle from happening, because you're mistreating the superego. So the crucifixion gives you access to the death of your false ego complex. But if you try to resurrect too early, if you try to resurrect on the first day after the crucifixion, you haven't been dead long enough. You have to lay in your grave for at least 2 days, because it says on the third day. So this is slightly weird, because the crucifixion itself already is the first day. The next day after that, you must lay dead. So you must actually not operate. That is the lust. That is the lust of the superego. Because the sin of the ego, which is the thing, which is the death in the body that is being crucified, because the sin is also the death of the sin of the ego is the death of the superego. So that is the death of Christ that must be in your body. That is the first day. The second day would be the lust of the superego. So that you must not do anything on that day. You must lie in the grave. And then on the third day, that is the New Jerusalem. That is the resurrection. So you must develop the thing beneath the false prophet, because that vanity, which will not be vanity, because it will be the New Jerusalem, because it doesn't have a lust attached to it. It doesn't have a child function. So you will develop a dominant function to get your parent function in your superego under control. So it's all about developing a dominant function to get the parent function in line. And then that parent function that is in line is no longer the false prophet, because it actually has a dominant function behind it. So in some sense, it's all about developing the dominant function beneath the superego parent function. So I do think that that is the full resolution. But let me just talk about how I was experiencing aberrant salience, because it's an interesting aside. So I believe that I was crucifying myself, but I didn't know what I was doing in terms of the false prophet. And I was like, am I actually, when I resurrect on the third day, that I'm reclaiming the false prophet? I didn't connect that with the dominant function behind it. And if I did connect it with the dominant function behind it, I was also including the lust function, because I was like, oh, these things have to kind of be together. And that is toxic. You have to specifically develop the one and specifically not develop the other one. Which is also very interesting, because the water is my lust function of my superego, the fourth dimension of psychological reality, which makes me think that Jesus Christ probably was a Metatype 13, because John the Baptist baptized Jesus with water. He needed a deacon to give him the water. It's interesting, but in some sense, anyway, I'm just generalizing. This is perhaps why you can't do it alone. You need at least one other person to give you that, because you can't have that. So you need to get that from a communion. You need to get that from association. You need to get that from somebody else, because in some sense you will always have that void. You will always have the root of the tree of life need space. Maybe I'm talking out of turn. Maybe I'm speculating about that. Maybe you eventually get that in the second cycle. Maybe you just need to do that for long enough that you discharge the content of the crucifixion, and then eventually that blank spot can be filled in individually. I don't know. But anyway, that's probably as far as I can go in terms of speculation at the moment. But I think that now that is a much more stable rendition of how treatment would then function. That you actually have to make sure that you do not develop that dimension in the superego, because it is the lust of your superego, at least in the process of expending and discharging the pent-up toxicity in your subconscious. Anyway, I'm very grateful to myself that I've now worked through this, because, oh my word, this puts me to rest to some degree. I think this gives me the real keys to my sanity, and it gives me a large measure of stability. So I'm quite happy about that. Sorry, I was just in my mind contrasting this to how I see other people that are supposedly enlightened, who I disdain because I say that they don't understand their own enlightenment, and therefore they're actually concocting quite a sort of profane form of sort of self-indulgence in some sense, because they do not have enough knowledge and understanding really to justify their experiential state, because they are experiencing the sudden from the left hand side of the divided line, in the divided line between the lesser of the lesser and the greater of the lesser, the first two segments of the divided line, to use a kind of Platonic metaphysical model. Anyway, yeah, so I think that lays things out very nicely. So let me stop this recording. I want to make an addendum to my last recording, and I'm slightly annoyed already because my thoughts are going off into many different directions, because I've already gone over this thoroughly in my own mind, and it touches on so many different parallel topics. So, I don't know, I want to make some comments about my own case, which I think are useful to generalize into the other species of metagram circuitry and the other species of metatype false ego complex, because that will offer some insight into structuring a body of knowledge into therapeutic intervention or a treatment of the false ego complex, of the various different subspecies and things like that. So I have some insight and classification that, as I was processing my own case, I believe now, and on the way to the synthesis now that I think I've reached a quite a firm stability, that how I metaphorically see my own problem with my own metagram circuitry. Okay, let me, instead of going into the subspecies, which are an interesting tangent, but let's say that is the most speculative form of, it's a useful speculation that needs to be the kernel of development later on, but let me just, because in some sense, I believe that maybe there are only like 4 types of metatype cases, but then they have like 4 different valences, because in some sense there are only like 4 different types of metatype cases, and then it's just a recycling of which type has what as their unconscious and which type has what as their subconscious, and they're just kind of the same sides of the mind but in slightly different configurations. It's more complicated than that, because there's 17, not 16, and so you don't get 4 sets of 4, you get 3 sets of 4 and 1 set of 5, and in some sense that fifth one can be tacked onto any one. So there are these ones which are kind of in the middle ground, where they're kind of half breeds, where they're like half of one set and half of another set. They're kind of like the middle road. And so in some sense, to a large extent, I think the karmic fields of field circuitry of false ego complex are warring between which set should be canonical, because in some sense where you draw the line of those 4 sets of 4 are prone to different forms of categorization in some sense, or grouping or something like that. Anyway, so, but in some sense I think that you would be able to reduce a stable amount of archetype. You would be able to extract a stable amount of, well, they're like in pure deep psychological terms, that they're like these kinds of cases which you might describe as being centered around different virtues or vices, that they are centered around different kinds of, just to use a mixed metaphor, over association in some sense, or a kind of thematic crystallization and accumulation of sort of issues that then seem to develop into that particular metagram circuitry and stuff. And then the interesting thing is that some people that have the same metatype have a different metagram circuitry, because essentially they're taking it on a different level, or their particular prime death or their particular kernel that eventually develops into the metagram circuitry is set in a particular level of the narrative. So in some sense, people that share the same metatype are perhaps exactly in the same melodrama, but they take a different interactive role within the melodrama. They take a different purchase of the whole thing. They take a different reading of the whole thing. And that is harder stylistically to describe, but essentially I believe that sattva is a Seth type, because the first thing in a sattva type is the inferior function, is essentially they are looking at the melodrama from the position first, in the first place, from the inferior function, whereas Rajas is taking it from the death position, and then the second step in Rajas is the sin. So they go from boundary to boundary, and in some sense they're very confused, because the death is also the death of one side of the mind, or at least especially in the unconscious, the death of the unconscious side of the mind is also the sin of the subconscious. And then they go from the unconscious death, and then the second step of the metagram circuitry is to look at the unconscious sin, and the unconscious sin is the lust in the ego, is the child function of the ego. So their first two steps are repurposed by different sides of the mind. So they are literally all over the place. Whereas sattva is like naturally weighted towards the ego. Actually, no, that's not even necessarily so. Because the first step in sattva is the inferior function, and the second step is the lust of the unconscious side of the mind. So if they go from the inferior function to the lust, then they are also juxtaposed between two sides of the mind. But the first side of the mind that they are dealing with is first the side of the mind that is corresponding with a crossover, because the inferior function of the unconscious is also the death of the ego. So they start off in the higher side, as they're in the first place, and then their second step of their metagram circuitry is the lust, which is the lust of the unconscious, is also did I misspeak earlier? I did misspeak earlier when I said that the inferior function of the when I said that the inferior function of the subconscious I think I said that the sin of the subconscious is the death of the unconscious, which was incorrect, because it's the inferior function of the subconscious which is the death of the unconscious, and it is the lust of the unconscious which is the sin of the subconscious. So sattva in the first place goes from the inferior function of the unconscious to the lust of the unconscious, which corresponds to, in the first place, the death of the ego, and in the second place, the sin of the subconscious. So in some sense, I think sattva is naturally disinclined against its own subconscious, which primes it to be in a better spiritual, psychological state of clarity, because in some sense it already is inclined towards reaching up towards the ego and jettisoning the subconscious, which is, I think, a necessary step in development, because you have to kind of try to cut your subconscious off, because if that narcissistic project never concludes, you can't develop the higher maturity or whatever to then eventually get the ego into such a state that you can even repair the fundamental flaw of the subconscious, because the fundamental flaw of the subconscious is inculcated in the subconscious, is inculcated within the super ego's nebulousness, which can only be fixed by the ego. So you kind of have to reach up through the top in order to fix the undergrowth or whatever. But anyway, so in some sense, I think that sattva is almost like archetypally a Seth type, who in the second place, this works in my archetypal metaphor analogy. So Seth is trying to work out how to reconcile things in reference to Eve, the mother of Cain and the mother of Abel, who is now murdered, that Seth has come to, in some sense, replace. But Seth sees himself as in the image of his father. And in some sense, Seth's father, Adam, is perhaps not even his father. It's almost more his grandfather, because in some sense, Seth is more Seth's immediate parent is the death of Abel, is the murder of Abel by Cain, is the immediate parent of Seth, and in some sense Adam is his grandfather, and he is in the image of his grandfather. He is born. Said in the scripture that Seth was born in the image of Adam, but I would like to say that Adam is not his father; he's his grandfather in some sense, because he was born. Who he was born to was the death of Abel. Seth was born to the death of Abel. That the death of Abel is his father. Anyway, this is a weird archetypal, messy sort of metaphor to make about things, but in some sense, I think Sattva can be said to be the Seth type. Rajas can be said to be the Adam type in some sense, and Tamas could be said to be the Cain type, because the first step of Tamas, I believe, is vanity, and the second step is the parent function, is the enticed lust. So Tamas is worst off because Tamas is right in the thick of it. It's right in the middle of it. And none of its first two places of its metagram circuitry give it any kind of clue that there's confusion in the field. Tamas is right in the middle of it, and from the starting position, it's born in the, well, when I say it's born, this is a metaphor, its perspective is rooted and anchored right in the thick of it, and it doesn't even see its own fundamental defective circuitry because its first two positions are stable. It's only when it gets to the third element in tamasic circuitry does it start to say, oh fuck, where am I? We're not in Kansas anymore. It's, what's going on here? Let me retreat back to my first two places. Whereas Sattva has no reason, has nothing else but to move forward, because it starts in the most uncomfortable position. It starts in the inferior function, and the second place of Sattva is the lust, which in some sense corresponds also to the subconscious sin. So it even grows because it sees the lust as the second place. It already sees that in the second place the mystery is dark and deep and confusing, and the mystery itself is fundamentally messy. And so it goes from one bad place to another bad place, and then Sattva moves on. And then in some sense, Sattva still has to overcome things. Not as if Sattva gets like a free meal. It just has a good starting position. But in some sense, the problem with Sattva, I can't remember the rest of the sequence, but I do think that the character of the first two things really gives you a good grounding in some sense. In this way, I think Sattva is more prone to borderline personality disorder than narcissism, because I think that it's not possible, well, everything is possible, but I think that in some sense, it would be harder. I shouldn't talk so generalistically. It's probably a bit too dangerous to do that, but yeah, let me just jettison that. But I could probably make a sweet excuse and talk about a complexity there that would show, it would be insightful, but let me not get sidetracked. But it would be problematically sort of a bit too oversimplistic. So anyway, what I wanted to get to talking about is that Keegan stage. Like I've said, oh, okay, I don't really believe in this Keegan stage 4.5. I believe that and perhaps Keegan gets into this. I haven't read his book, but essentially I think that there would be something like two things. That everyone has a Keegan stage 3.5 that they have to progress through. And in some sense, every Keegan stage 3.5 is going to have a Keegan stage 4.5 projection sort of codependently as part of its adjunct nature. And the point here is that Keegan stage 3, the problem with progressing through Keegan stage 3.5 is that you have to be able to see the wood from the trees, because in some sense you're not just dealing with your own Keegan stage 3.5, you're dealing with the Keegan stage 3.5 of the people in your vicinity. So if you don't have enough self-determinism, if you don't have enough control of your immediate environment, if you're forced to share space and you're dominated and subjugated by other people that are very, very toxic and unhealthy, um, so much so that you don't have, enough control over some sphere of your life that you can do self-exploration and I, do, what's it called in Maslow's hierarchy, individuation or something like that. You need to be able to have the freedom to explore some sense of self-individuation in order to disassociate your Keegan stage 3.5 from the shadow of the culture and the shadow of others within your culture, within your vicinity. I mean, this is the positive and the negative of the toxicity of juvenile association. You need some level of juvenile association in order to get sick of it, in order to kind of think, okay, where is this actually going? Eventually, I mean, some people, especially in the subconscious, that's where it's more toxic in some sense, because when other people, when you are driven by the kind of envy or competitive nature, in some sense when your friends are also your enemies. But some people need friends that are also their enemies, friends that will actually ridicule them, friends that will cut them if they are too weak or something like that, because at that stage of juvenile development, like, they don't have a positive purpose that they are conserving for themselves. They don't have an internal interior drive. They haven't developed any kind of sovereignty yet. So instead they need the camaraderie. They need the messy camaraderie of sort of being torn by the hyena cackles and the cuts of 1,000 paper cuts to kind of to usher them towards keeping up their game in some sense, until they can kind of grow a bit jaded of, like, do I actually need this? And then realizing, oh, actually I do need this, I actually am dependent on it, and then blaming themselves for that, leaving no stone unturned, and developing and maturing. So in some sense you need juvenile friends so that you have something to graduate out of, that you have something to grow beyond. It has a lesson to be taught there. Obviously, it's very destructive when you never graduate, when you just kind of, when the collateral support is so comfortable and is so cozy that you never want to give it up, and you think that that's all there is, or something like that. Now, that's something like the problem of Keegan stage 3.5, is that when you're in the melodrama, when you're in this, you haven't even noticed, oh, actually, all the problems in my life are all variations of the same theme, are all the same kind of problem, and actually I don't realize it, but I'm actually creating it myself. Or even if I'm not creating it myself, I could be said to be creating it myself, because I'm not taking proactive management and responsibility to control the things that I would have to learn to control in order to manage this preemptively. So you blame yourself in a bootstrapping way in order to disassociate from the muddle of Keegan stage 3.5, so that you can actually start to discriminate and distinguish what is my Keegan stage 3.5 and what is the Keegan stage 3.5 on other people's plates. Because let me not eat the food on other people's plates. Maybe I can think I can help them, but it's actually very hard to help other people. It's very, very hard to help other people. Because the more that you help them, the more that you undercut their own self-determinism and self-ownership and self-responsibility. So this is the problem in some sense as well, is that we actually do need a Keegan stage 4 modeled to us. Like, literally modeled to us, that allows us to open our awareness. And in some sense it can just give you the answer, maybe, as well. But then that's also toxic if you don't actually verify the answer for yourself, and are actually, because there's one thing to be told the truth, it's another thing to know the truth for yourself. So these are kinds of the paradoxes around Keegan stage 3.5, and in some sense you get into, let's say, a very toxic Keegan stage 3.5 when there's a mirror 4.5 that is like the umbrella protecting your juvenile 3.5. And this is what fascist ideology is, fascist philosophy, fascist religion. You know, there's lots of false religion, there's lots of false teaching, there's lots of false prophecy that tells you, yeah, this is all there is. And then you grow fat on that sympathy, and then you depend on that sympathy, because in some sense, and you still want to blame the world for your heart disease. I mean, this is a weak metaphor, but you see, it's that kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, because you've got this very toxic twin tower of, you know, I'm trying to evoke the what was it, the two towers, Lord of the Rings. Um, the ivory tower is 4.5, and then the kind of the Eye of Sauron. Anyway, it's kind of like the collective field of karma that you're naturalizing, that you're saying, give us sympathy for our field circuit. Just let us keep our field circuit. We don't want to be we don't want to be sovereign individuals. We want to be plugged in. Uh, we want to be able to expect that people assimilate, because we don't want to have to justify our sovereignty or something like that. Okay, we don't want to have a justified understanding, but in some sense we also don't want to clean up Keegan stage 4. We don't want to deal with that. We want to stay in the melodrama, because we're addicted to it. We're drunk on it. And so there is this weird sort of parallel that there's always, let's say, a ghost of a 4.5 around what I'm calling a 3.5. And in some sense, I think people have actually legitimately developed 4.5 themselves before regressing back to 3.5. I think that even happens quite early in development. I think maybe around 12 years old, between 11 and 13 years old. I think that kind of what happens is that intellectually you get to a certain level, but then society kind of bullies you. So when I say society, I mean like literally bullies in school make you feel bad, or the culture makes you feel bad because it's like you're 13 years old, you don't look like a man or a woman yet. You are, you know, sort of going through the ravages of puberty. You have these strong hormones and emotions, and you're growing, but you're also misshapen, therefore. And so, you know, everything is in doubt, you know, because you can't see the future, and how you look is sort of, you know, you're in a state of metamorphosis. So I think that in that state of metamorphosis, you get actually a very clear window into Keegan stage 4. You actually arrive there, but then you kind of, you take some hard knocks, and then you kind of revert back to a 3.5, because that's how you see yourself within the culture, because the culture looks fallen. Everything looks like it's worthy to be dissatisfied about, and in some sense it's a mirror reflection of the self to some degree. It's a projection from the self outwards, and you're actually creating a 4.5 thing where you're allowed to do that. You're allowed to project your problems onto the melodrama around you, because then you can disguise it, and then you can self-indulge in your self-delusion and your self-toxicity, and then because you're just mixing up your 3.5 plate that you should be trying to process, that you should be trying to work through. You're just going to add it to the feast. You're going to add it to the what's it called, when you can eat whatever you want because you pay, buffet. You add it to the buffet. So you kind of, the 4.5 3.5 is that, you know, you collectivize yourself. You join, you try to be gods as themselves. The serpentine seduction and the promise of the serpent, as you are adopted by the serpent, and in some sense, anyway. You try to create an external locus of authority and control to absorb the responsibility of your sovereignty, to infantilize you and to bequeath it to you, to bestow it onto your identity, because you've given up being human. That's the 4.5, 3.5 sort of thing. Now, it's more complicated than that, because some people don't actually reach Keegan stage 4.5, but they are stably at 3.5 because they're under the tutelage of somebody else. They join a religion that has a false teaching like this. They join a political party that has a teaching like this. They join a clique. Usually these cliques are centered around a kind of a female energy that we're all going to make it. We all deserve to make it. This mustn't be taken out of context, because that's not a bad hope to have, that we're all going to make it. It's the methodology of how the strategy of making it happens. That it happens by saying, no, we have an entitlement, and we're not going to justify that entitlement by our procedure and our process and by defending our values with reasoning. We're just going to narrate it, and we're just going to say, well, our narrative is better, and it uses symbols and it uses tokens and it uses totems, and it's basically a form of idolatry, in the same way that idolatry is a very strange thing to define, because in some sense, you can turn anything into an idolatry. You can turn culture into idolatry. You can turn a legal system into an idolatry, and you can turn the lack of those things into an idolatry. So it's like you can say, you can have very high sexual standards of sexual norms and sexual mores that you hold, but in some sense that can become an idolatry. Abstinence and celibacy, like, why are you being it? Why are you choosing to do that? That's more important. The why and the how need to be in alignment, not just this kind of narrative of why, or this formula of how that you can't justify in your understanding. Now, it's obviously also okay for the young to follow guidelines before they understand them, but they should hold that out as something that they need to evaluate for themselves at some time. They need to be told when they can evaluate it for themselves and reevaluate it perhaps, and then do the requisite cleaning up in some sense, so that we can somewhat perhaps protect sovereignty. But in some sense, I think it's almost better not for very young children to be exposed to lots of beliefs, that they should develop their own beliefs somewhat organically, somewhat perhaps within the family unit. And when they are in the stage of their unconscious side of the mind quite fully, then that is when they should be taking input from far afield. That is when they should be seeing all the different, the vastly different variety of different forms of ways of managing karma. And that is perhaps also very dangerous when children are very impressionable, and when they're liable to become perhaps drug addicts as well. And that kind of danger, sadly, I think is almost inescapable, because this is somewhat connected to the Jordan Peterson thing, that boys should be allowed to skateboard. They need to be able to kind of learn to take risks and how to manage danger and things like that. Otherwise, we're really stunting their growth. We're really stunting their moral growth and their moral fiber and their character development. Because we are. Damn, I had a good word. Now I can't remember it. Something that means like, sort of, we're pasteurizing them. But there's a better word than that, but it probably has a medical connotation. I can't remember. Something like homogenization, but in a very sort of, in some sense, we're not growing the new generation. We're trying to sort of manufacture them tabula rasa, kind of. Anyway, I, this is the trade-off between sympathy and sustainability. Again, I would say, um, and perhaps this is also why film and art can be so valuable, because you can explore these things in film and art. People can watch a good movie and they can say, okay, well, that's why some things can be very dangerous and very seductive, and how they lead to a bad end, and how they don't work out, and how they're not sustainable, and they are self-destructive. But in some sense, anyway, the melodrama can be very inebriating, of the unconscious mind, especially the contextual melodrama of your peers and of the state of society, and the context that the karma of the unconscious mind sort of forebodes and foreshadows. And these are very hard things for children to. That's why it can be very useful for children to have friends, confidants, because then it allows many people with many different personality styles to use each other's insights. Because in some sense, sometimes, I mean, this is also why I think the young are so badly asexualized and desexualized in this current generation, is because before it used to be that you were part of some kind of ragtag community. You were some part of, that the young, that two people would try to have a pseudo relationship maybe, and things would fall apart because because everyone's a juvenile. But then maybe like the girls talk to each other about it and the boys talk to each other about it, and they sort of troubleshoot it, and they learn something. They learn from each other, from seeing themselves and each other through each other's eyes. And there's a knowledge there, there's an insight there, um, that is developing a form of self-knowledge, and more clearly, that gets you up to being able to distinguish between your Keegan stage 3 that you have to break through in order to get to Keegan stage 4. And some people need other eyes on that, because in some sense, without enough other eyes, it's not so much that you can't see yourself, but you can't see the other influences around you, that you can have a clear enough boundary between yourself as distinct from other people, because you don't know how much of what's on your plate was put on your plate by somebody else. Maybe somebody else snuck things onto your plate, and actually they don't belong on your plate. And you need a third person to tell you, yeah, that person put that on your plate. That doesn't belong to you. You don't have to process that. That's his problem. That's not your problem. That's his Keegan stage 3. That's not your Keegan's Keegan stage 3.5. That's his Keegan stage 3.5. I'm making a metaphor. So that is why you need some, and in some sense, that collective insight gives you a way to model to you a kind of Keegan stage 4, a systemized understanding of things. That becomes a tentative model of a systemized understanding of roles and how roles interact. Because when you start seeing, and then sadly you do need religion. The problem with Keegan stage 4 is that I think it's only properly stabilized by some kind of spiritual, religious insight to some degree, and quite a high level. I would say, you need to be able to have something like the technology of the crucifixion, the technology of forgiveness. But forgiveness is very toxic if it's not done, let's say, with the right implication in terms of the self. You can't just forgive things because for the purposes of consequentialism. It's not about consequentialism. It's about the fact that actually you are part of this emergent sin, as it were. That sin is an emergent property, that you are de facto a participant therein. Because in some sense you could prevent other people from sinning. You could give yourself the role to prevent other people from sinning, and you could combat and prevent quite a lot of sin just by your participation in the field circuits. So this is the problematic sort of thing, is that the way to crucify yourself is in the ego, is not in the unconscious side of the mind. The unconscious side of the mind does not crucify itself. It's the ego that crucifies itself, in some sense, for adopting the insight, but it's expended. Crucifixion happens on the ego, not on the unconscious. Anyway, and this allows you to actually repair your own superego in the way that I've described in the last recording. And this means that you actually stop contributing to the field of karma, and you perhaps develop a golden circuit, which still doesn't give you perfect power, because some circuits don't even exist on every field circuit. They only exist on 2 field circuits. So I think that, some people don't have the resources to be a perfect, singular, free radical field auditor. Some people can't be a field auditor, perhaps. Or they could in particular teams, in very particular prescribed ways in which that they were targeting a certain kind of process or a certain kind of goal that they were aiming to achieve. Anyway, some people do depend on some kind of community. I mean, we are almost naturally social creatures. And in some sense, even the free radicals that I just kind of referred to, they need to share their faith with other people. They need to have a shared faith. Otherwise, what's the point? In some sense, I mean, because in some sense, the gold circuitry isn't even gold in relation to the field circuit. It's only gold in relation to the ego. So if you don't have other egos that themselves consider themselves to have gold circuits, false ego metagram circuitry, then it's irrelevant, because gold is in the eye of the beholder in this sense. It's in the eye of the spiritual discerner. And if you are the only spiritual discerner, then you might as well be this is technically not true, but because I think that there is still a difference between being capable of justifying your enlightenment and your understanding and sharing it with other people is still better than being a free radical enlightened person that cannot justify or understand their own enlightenment. If you do not understand your own enlightenment, it is unjustified and it is problematic. But I'm just saying that if you can't share a faith with anyone, then you almost might as well be, so that's how I'm going to phrase it, you almost might as well be that kind of free radical enlightened person that is seeing the sudden from the left hand side of the divided line and not from the right hand side, between the lesser of the lesser and the lesser of the greater, the first 2 sections of the divided line, which is where the sudden exists, in the meeting place between the opinion and the notional conceptual, the realm of anyway. I'm not going to expound on the divided line right now, but okay, so I talked roughly to outline some of the subtype kind of different types of cases, which are interesting, because I do want to end up exploring that more, because that'll make it easier for me to type people if I can start recognizing their cases, the kinds of cases, the species of cases, like down to their core, because then I would be able to much more easily map exactly where their problem is, where they're getting snagged in their Keegan stages, because I would have, let's say, a full rendition of ontologically how that type generally, in some form or some style, how it is structured. So that'll be quite interesting. And I already have an idea of some cases, because I do think that there are some cases that are essentially, look, there are some generic things that kind of plague many different types of metatypes, but I think there is also often a way in which that those generic problems are assimilated stylistically into what in Scientology would be called something like the basic engram. And I still think, perhaps selfishly, perhaps, that my metatype 13 is also a very special metatype 13. Um, my particular metagram of metatype 13, I do think might be very, very special, because it is weird that it does have a presence on all four of the field circuits. And I do think I know why it is such a robust metagram type, because in some sense I think it is envious of self-realization. Now I'm going to get a little bit spooky and mystical here, because I'm going to kind of metaphoricalize a lot of things. I should maybe read my note, because my note is quite interesting. But let me see if I can. First, I'll try to say it until I mess it up, and then I'll look at the note. So I think the way to kind of reduce my whole case, and I've already said that I'm like a Seth case. That's like a structural thing. Let me talk about the actual issue at the core of my case. So, like, I really think that I opened the lid on understanding and seeing past my own case to a large degree, because I considered the fact that I really do think that I am my own grandfather, like in a very tangible way. Like, my particular history, even, like, my grandmother was like quite a mystic herself. She always said that she inherited the eye from her Scottish ancestry or whatever, that the firstborn in her line always gets handed down from them, that they inherit the eye or whatever. Like that she's kind of like saying that, she's part of a famous lineage of seers or something like that, and she's Scottish and she's Welsh. I think she's more Welsh than Scottish or whatever, and I think she said that the I comes from the Welsh side. But anyway, the thing is that I believe when I was unborn, that I communicated with my grandmother, uh, and I don't know if I want to talk about this because it's a bit personal, but in some sense, I kind of had to I kind of had to make a contract so that I could live. I kind of had to. So it was very strange, because I kind of had to make a certain kind of. I had a very, very interesting conversation, I think, with my grandmother, because it was not a good situation to be in for anyone in some sense. Um, it was a very messy, messy situation, and I had to give some assurance that essentially my grandmother would fight so that I could be born and that I could live. But the cost of that was that I had to be good to my mother, or I had, because my grandmother loves my mother as well, and I have to not be judgmental against my mother or something like that. And so I was kind of already, even before I was born, and you look, maybe my grandmother just believed that she had this conversation with me, and then I transpersonally absorbed it after I was born. I mean, I don't. That's another possibility in some sense, because children are very intuitive and they're very intelligent, and if this is on my grandmother's mind, and my grandmother did talk to me about this contract throughout my life, um, in her way, but also at some point explicitly. So I believe that it's part of my timeline. I believe that it really happened. Anyway, it's not that important, but in some sense it is, I think, the incident that somewhat was the core of my whole case. Um, and in some sense, this was the kernel of my whole prime death in my subconscious. But I mean, it's not a bad prime death to have, because we all have to fall into creation. We all have to. I don't believe it's possible to live in this world without developing a false ego complex, because otherwise you have no way to experience the world. You have to give up one of your cognitive functions to emulate a collective experience. So she was talking to me on the level of, in some sense, the probably just before my false prophet. So she was communicating to me on the dimension below the what then became my false prophet, because essentially the false prophet, I think, is the archetype of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil. So because of this communication below that level, I reacted to that in a reticent way, because I don't think there's another way to react to it. And I developed a knowledge of good and evil around that contract to some degree. And generally what that amounted to, because I did it in a very careful way, I didn't react to it in a zealous way. I tried to not react to it. Explicitly, I tried not to react to it. And I think I even succeeded until the age of 7. In some sense, I knew that I could develop a false ego complex, and I just was clever enough never to do so until the age of 7. But between the age of 4 and the age of 7, I'd already kind of committed myself that I actually was going to go through and develop a false ego complex, because then I could use myself as a lab rat to better understand the false ego complex. Anyway, but anyway, like, I, this is actually interesting if I talk more about myself, I guess, to some degree. But essentially, that dimension that the false prophet is on, the knowledge of good and evil, in some sense, is because, like, well, is the dimension that corresponds to why things shall be some way, which is what I also call the salt. Why things shall be some way. I also, the one word for that I call eminence. It is the dimension of psychological reality that I correspond to eminence. And in some sense, it's all about, in the summation of it, it's about how should you greet things? Why shall things be some way? It all has to start, or it all has to end, or it all has to be summarized into how shall you greet your life? How shall you? So that my whole knowledge of good and evil is all centered around that theme in some sense. And in some sense, this is another way of saying, well, I'm transpersonal. That essentially, that when I spoke to my grandmother, I was joining the rank of my grandparents, and I became my own grandparent. And I even had to treat my own parents as if I was one level higher than them, like I was one of my own grandparents. And so I always had to kind of worry about my parents, which was very easy to do because they were a complete mess. I mean, well, that's what happens when you have a shotgun wedding, I guess. So I have the problems that I have sort of inherited, and it became more complicated than that because, and maybe this is a made up story, maybe I'm crazy, maybe this is aberrant salience, but when I'm talking to a government scientist who says that I was also part of a genetic experiment and that they grafted genetic material when I was an embryo or in the creation of my embryo, so that essentially I almost have 3 parents, and the genetic contribution comes from a sample from thousands of years ago, and that genetic contribution is an unknown thing to some degree. So not only am I my own grandparent, but there's also actually also an unknown element in my grandparent that I can also sort of substitute for as myself. So not only am I one of my own grandparents, but my grandparentage, whatever, my parentage is itself has a mysterious factor to it, which I'm symbolically representing as well. So not only am I my own grandparent, but I don't know what's in my own parentage as well, which also gave me this whole very unsavory theme of essentially questioning my own. So it wasn't actually such a horrible thing to question, I guess, because I never liked my father, my natural father. He always seems to be pretty much a monster to me. But both of my parents were, I think, incredibly dysfunctional and perhaps also aggravated each other's dysfunctionality. I mean, blah blah blah. But anyway, I mean, when you're 2 years old, when you're 3 years old, and you're dealing with people that are literally immature, that are literally less mature than you are, and you are somewhat selfishly having to try to structure your life so as to, because in some sense my whole life was the selfish motivation of not wanting, of wanting to live, was the selfish motivation of and then living with the curse, which is quite a famous and old curse in spirituality in some sense, which is that the greatest ill of the world is unwanted population, and essentially being born as unwanted population, save for my grandparents. In some sense, the only stability and security that I had was my own grandparents, and of which I was one of them, essentially. So I'm stuck in this transpersonal, impersonal relation to my own life, even because I'm not a direct participant. I'm a causative influence over my own life. And in some sense, not by my own design. I do also remember that it was by contract, in some sense, that I contracted in order to save my life. Um, so it's a huge sort of causative weight there. And in some sense, although this sounds quite self-pitying, and it perhaps is quite self-pitying, but it also is quite liberating, because in some sense, I don't have to try to grasp for reaching my sovereignty. I don't have to try to build my sovereignty. I was born sovereign. They call children masters as their title. And in some sense, I was a master that could never not be a master, that never dropped being a master, even as I moved on into adulthood. Because usually in adulthood is when you lose your master status. I, in some sense, never lost it because of my metagram. But anyway, my metagram was able to take that from my subconscious, at least, to import that sovereignty. And there was a lot of, but that isn't just sovereignty in my subconscious. There's also toxicity there. There is also overreach, because beliefs themselves are never perfect. Context will always break them. And when you try to save your beliefs by putting them into sets of beliefs, that's even worse. That's even more toxic. Which is why the subconscious eventually jettisons the inferior function and the sin of the subconscious, and creates the unconscious side of the mind, which I think I explained quite beautifully in the last recording, so let me not revisit that. But just focusing more on my own false ego complex. So that's interesting that I was my own grandfather, and that I even remember when I was like 5 years old, I came up and I told one of my playmates to give me this message back to me later in life, because it was such a wonderful insight, which was, there was this other thinker who was my peer, who was 5 years old, who was very intelligent, like I was, I think, and we actually had a deep exchange, and he was giving me some insights about things, and I can't remember, maybe I spoke to someone's parents or something like that, and he was teaching me some big words, and which I learned how to define words to people, which was very useful into accumulating more knowledge and such. But and I worked out that I was definitely prone to a thematic defect, and that thematic defect I called a kindred stigma syndrome. Because in some sense, a stigma, the definition that I use, that I use this good dictionary, um, stigma is defined as a mark or a symbol of disgrace, or I can't remember the other word, or impurity, I think. So it's a mark of impurity or disgrace. And in some sense, that is the fundamental defect of my whole false ego complex, is that being my own grandfather, I can't directly participate in some sense. It creates this kind of wall of generalization that I have to pierce in a very knowing way. So I can't say that I didn't consider the consequences. So it forces you to somewhat be incredibly careful, um, or at least not, because of essentially the pretension of sovereignty. Because there's nothing that can't transpire that isn't your fault in some sense, because it's automatically bootstrapped in some sense. So the weight of the world is on my shoulders, as it were, and you feel that weight in this type, in this metagram type. Anyway, let me move on from this. Now, in some sense, even that is understood in some sense, because I think that there's a deeper theme here, which is that this whole development of the false ego complex isn't just, oh, I'm reacting to this contract that I made with my grandmother. It's not that she planted this in my head and then it grew. No, no, no. You plant it in your own head. And when you take in that seed and you water it and you feed it and it grows, it's not from the outside that it came. There's a quiet place that you actually calculate. You deliberately fed it. You deliberately cultivated it. And in that place, then you actually work out the positive trade. You have actually equivalently exchanged the death with your own life. You have converted the life of your own beingness into the knowledge of the fruit of good and evil. And so in that exchange, it's actually deeper than what I've just said, which is a very self-pitying sort of narrative, which is that I told myself a second secret death on the other side of life, which is that this is a false ego complex that is actually without sin. Because all you are doing is you are choosing to envy the truth. You are choosing to envy the truth of your own authentic self-realized self, but you're going to do it through the metaphor of envy of the objects of the false ego complex. You're going to do it through the metaphor of the envy of karma itself. You're going to plug into all of karma, and you are going to recapitulate and reconstruct the likeness of the true self-realized mind, the likeness of the image of the Son of God. But you're going to do it through, and this is the metaphor, this is the best metaphor I can come up with, animal husbandry. In the same way that Adam named all the creatures of the earth. That is how the field of karma has been stored with identities and melodrama and confected systems of woven intrigue and seduction. and mechanical impingement and interrelatedness. So you have all of those wheels within wheels within wheels of that can be perfectly ordered on the living side of the spirit, but which are projected on the outside as creature comfort, passion, lust, conditioning, environmental subjugation. The environmental dominion of the realm of dens and legions of and hordes of hives, um, because that's what karma is. It's the assimilation of the external authority at the destruction and the denigration of the interior living authority of the spirit, and the understanding of that the spirit, the discerning spirit, the spirit of wisdom and judgment, the spirit of the Lord. And so you have this um, how do I put this? So if you read 1 John chapter 5 in the King James, it's very obvious what it's talking about. I mean, it's just a little bit confusing when it's talking about the Trinity, the three that bear record in heaven, and the three that bear witness in the earth. But 1 John chapter 4 and 1 John chapter 5, summary of the whole doctrine. It's very, very clear. We're talking about Christ consciousness. That the understanding is eternal life and is God, is the condition of the mind, the condition of that the life is in the only begotten Son, that the name of the Son, believe in the name. Anyway, so the doctrine, I think, gives the rubric. It gives. I mean, obviously, the problem is that to understand the doctrine, that's the difficulty. But especially in the proper context of all the things that need to happen. But what is my point? My point here is that so I was talking about my own false ego complex, and I was talking about that essentially the central theme of my whole false ego complex, and maybe everyone else can also uncover the same theme from the living side of things. Let's say the happy contract. I can't remember who did it, but who talked about the fall in this way. Maybe it was Aquinas or something, but the happy fall, the happy mistake, because that it will be redeemed, that it was not an error, but that it was a mistake. That we will always be prone to mistake, but we will not be prone to error. That we will attain to a single faith that does attain to the full stature of Christ, and we will still make mistakes, and we can save each other from each other's mistakes, but we will not be error prone. Anyway, and this is like, in terms of the internal, let's say, fortification, the internal resilience and majesty. of the original word, of the truth that was hidden from you, from your own sinful deviation and tearing into the false ego complex, which in some sense I still think is useful because it gives us a way to firmly, this is perhaps a bit too extravagant in metaphor, but it gives us a way to encircle the tree of life in order to be able to share it in some sense with a city. This is something that's a weird sort of thing, but it said in the Old Testament, in the Christian Old Testament, that the Lord swallowed a city. And in Revelation, it talks about the New Jerusalem, and I do think that that was one of the things that slowed down. That's why history had to happen, or spiritual work had to happen rather, and we had to wait until people who were willing to contribute towards that lineage, that of developing. I do think that there was a covenant that it is a project. It is a project that has been shared by lineages, and it's been a collective thing, that it doesn't just happen within the lineage of that line. It's something that everyone is doing because everyone is part of this consciousness in some sense. That the alchemy of it is that it is all encompassing, essentially. Okay, I guess that's it. I'm probably leaving out some themes, but I guess the threads will kind of come to me after I finish this recording, and then I'll just try to patch that up. But let me just think if there was anything else to go back and talk about. So yeah, I was just talking about myself, I guess, and I do think that anyway, this might be an unfair hack in some sense, because maybe other people's New Jerusalem will be discovered in a different, according to their metatype, according to their metagram as well, according to their particular ontological, because in some sense I do think that you do have to fix the ontological damage in the subconscious, but you only get there with the right procedure, and then kind of, then you're knocking on the door, and then the door opens, and then the truth is finally, sort of ameliorates you, reconciles with you. But but it is interesting that essentially, well, I guess the thing that I wanted to talk about more was the animal husbandry metaphor. But maybe I got away with that. Maybe that's good enough for people to understand. But I mean, in some sense, it is an interesting insight that essentially all of sin and karma can be somewhat reduced to something like animal husbandry, because in some sense, when you sort of incline yourself towards personalizing an animal, when you incline yourself towards dignifying something that is not a human understanding, that is not really a sentient being. Like, that's not to say that animals can't embody things. That's not even to say that you can't communicate with animals. But you're not communicating with sentient beings. Maybe some animals do have sentience. Maybe some whales do have sentience. Maybe. Maybe some primates have sentience. Um, and that is perhaps and I'm not saying, well, if something doesn't have sentience, then you can torture it and be cruel to it. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I do think that we should exemplify a sanctity for life, because human beings are not only sentient, they're also alive. And that is why I think that we should have a sanctity for life and conservation, and why we should have regenerative agriculture. But I think it's also important, I think that we do eat animals, because we do also know that they are not the same as us. They are not as morally significant as us. That doesn't mean that they can't be farmed healthily. And in some sense, what we do to them, we really do to ourselves as well, when we just kind of pump them full of whatever they get pumped full of. That, and then we get mad cow disease or something like that. Um, anyway, let me though get back to more of this sort of metaphor of the animal husbandry, because in some sense another element to, I mean, is very sort of, I mean, there are lots of metaphors that actually work. Another good metaphor is sexuality, because in some sense the material substrate of having a new generation is encapsulated within the family, and within family life, and within sexual relations, and how children are reared within a family unit, in some sense, within a community. So, that's also a kind of metaphor. And in some sense, it's not bad to even have a metaphor. You can use metaphors. The problem, something, is that when the metaphors get mixed up, at least when you're dealing with family, you're dealing with people that are sentient. You're dealing with people that are capable of free will, that are capable of having an understanding, that are capable of attaining to a single faith, or functioning within a single faith. That's not quite the same with animals. So when people kind of have, and I'm using perhaps animal husbandry a bit too strangely as a metaphor, but in some sense, if you think that you can be friends with an animal, and then you're kind of likening other people to animals, because it's like you've got this general sort of computer in your mind of associations and stuff like that. This is not to say that you can't have pets. This is not to say that you can't love your pets, in inverted commas, of having kind regard for them, and sort of imagining that they have personalities, and an understanding of things that they don't, and kind of imagining that they are, because there are ways in which they can communicate, but it's perhaps I should be more careful and get into technical things here before I misspeak, essentially. But what are they communicating is kind of the issue. And that fundamental nebulousness about what they are communicating is very dangerous to a large extent, because you can kind of project whatever the hell you want. And in some sense, the whole thing is based on a weird kind of projective sympathy. And as soon as you develop that kind of weird kind of projective sympathy, then you've got a model in which to kind of slot people into that. And then anyways, I mean, that's another source of toxic sympathy. And then you get the sustainability sympathy trade off in some sense. Now, a lot of this can be benign. You can just, well, I mean, not everyone, let's say, is going to attain to a single faith. Not everyone is going to get a proper understanding. And maybe we do need to say, well, that's a crazy cat lady. She never became really a personable person that worked out how to have social skills, because she was satisfied by her cats or something like that. And, that is not to say that you can't have a vibrant family life and also have a few cats as pets. And you can use them to teach responsibility, and then you can also, okay, well, actually that cat is sick and we need to put her down, and then you learn something about life as well. Perhaps you learn something about the circle of life. Um, it's a anyway. So it's you can't say to have animals is bad, to have animals is good. It's like neither of those statements work out. That's not sort of what I'm saying. It's about the why and the how, as it were. Um, as long as you're grateful for the right things, you can kind of, everything becomes, let's say, an organic and fluid, natural sort of embodiment of understanding and harmony or something like that within a particular context potentially, um, that makes it justifiable. Uh, so anyway, what am I babbling about now? So it's a bit annoying, I guess, that I still have this transpersonal metagram circuitry. Because maybe that's the next thing for me to speculate about. If there's a way to expand or to contract that golden circuit, or if anything else can be done with it. But in some sense, that might just be what I am bound to function through. Hmm. I wonder, or if from the New Jerusalem, if you couldn't grew wholesale new structures and alternative personality schemas. I guess that's something that I need to still ponder over or try to experiment with, see how stable that sort of is. But let's see how that corresponds to the golden circuit. If you can sort of gild tendrils of golden, sort of. Anyway, that's just pure speculation at this point. But so are there any other things for me to think about? But in some sense, I'm just trying to think how unsatisfactory it is that I've kind of developed that thing in my head, because in some sense, that might be a kind of a toxic via positiva in my subconscious, or at least that grounds my subconscious that, oh yes, none of it was sin anyway, because in some sense, it was part of my project to learn about the false ego complex, and I was just using it in order to try to reconstruct it from the other side, which is actually almost impossible, but at least you can kind of make the semblance of a bridge, make a semblance of an arrow, a semblance of a gesture of how you reach the boundary, and then you can step to the other side. There's a almost archetypally, I think this existed within Westworld, although in the general theme of the plot, this is perhaps because there was a season after this, but in the sense in which I think the third season, I think I might have the numbers, but it's at this point in time they've had an extra season. So whatever the season before this last season was, that's the season that I'm referring to, which is when they're told that if they walk through this gateway, that then they go to the promised land, essentially. And they do go to the promised land when they walk through the gateway, but then their actual android bodies fall lifeless into a pit because they're being uploaded into this artificial computer server, sort of heaven for them to live in, because they didn't actually sort of grow individual consciousness. So that was sort of the best place for them to kind of live out, because they wouldn't be able to, anyway, what is my point of saying that? I was just trying to show the juxtaposition that, like, when you see the material fact is that these people die and they fall into the pit. But they're actually not dead, that all their software is actually uploaded into the cloud. But someone would say, oh, look, they're giving up incarnation. And what are they getting? They're getting a lie. But, I mean, they're getting something that's exactly equal to their what is good for them in some sense. And exactly what they want in some sense as well. And essentially the only way that you could deny them that is by saying, no, that they deserve an extra sympathy, that we should grant them some extra sympathy, whereas, like, they're being given a promise. And anyway, and maybe that paradise place and the software isn't the end of the road. It's part of the evolution and development of those consciousnesses. I always think that kind of scene, in some sense, is the pre-making of the Battlestar Galactica universe, in which, in some sense, it's a better precursor of the Cylon consciousnesses that were kind of being explored in the prequel series. Man, I can't even remember what the prequel series was called now. It was called, I think, what the planet was called. No, I can't remember it now. Damn it. That's embarrassing. That's so embarrassing. I can't remember what the prequel series was called of Battlestar Galactica. The one where they are just focused on artificial intelligence and creating artificial intelligence, which eventually led to the first Cylon Wars. Essentially, it was the prequel to the first Cylon Wars, or the invention of artificial intelligence in that civilization of the 12 colonies, in the Battlestar Galactica. It started with a C. What was the name of the planet that started with a C? Damn it. Started with a C or an S, or it sounds like an S, but it's spelled with a C. Oh my word, this is embarrassing. Anyway. I think that the Westworld, I think it's season 3 of Westworld, how it ends like that, and that was, yeah, I really believe that the writing in Westworld season 3 was some of the best writing ever. Especially how it ends. Like the last 6 episodes of season 3, I mean, perhaps it's too conceited to say this about myself, but I would say that it's Shakespearean in depth and in some sense the whole series was just a build up of plot in order for it to shine on that level, in order for it to shine on that level of complexity and grandeur. And it is perhaps a lot to sit through. And this is so embarrassing. I think I might have the seasons wrong. How many seasons of how many seasons of Westworld were there? Were there just 3 for the main story to end with the park? so I'm speaking as if the third season of Westworld, they were still in the park in the third season. I guess there's also a park in the fourth season, so maybe that's a, not the clever distinction to make. But the season that doesn't have Jesse in it, Jesse from Breaking Bad, the season before the season with Jesse in it, that I'm taking to be like a kind of a nice general conclusion in some sense. I think that that story almost has the seed of what should have been the kind of the nature of the prequel of Battlestar Galactica, because those prequel series didn't uh, weren't as strong as they should have been. But essentially, there wasn't also at that time. It was kind of the wrong time to have that kind of writing. You needed to. Well, it was there in Westworld, is what I'm basically saying. But you can kind of glue those two things together in some sense. In a metaphorical sort of way. But anyway, I'm babbling so much now. But I guess the problem that I generally have, though, is that I have no sympathy for sympathy. I can tolerate it, but I always know that I'm tolerating it. Perhaps that's why I can't allow myself to participate, but it's also because I don't trust other people that they can follow the rules that are implicit in their own contract. So essentially, I'm not dealing with other people that are sovereign, so their contracts are, or at least if they do have sovereignty, it's a very soft form of sovereignty. It's a sovereignty that is so reticent and so primed to invalidate it itself post hoc, to sort of, it will repudiate its own actions and complain about a grander context of conspiracy against itself, and it'll just narrate bullshit after bullshit because it has no capability of bootstrapping. It has no sense of it has this kind of deceitfulness attached to it. But sadly, a lot of that is self-deceitfulness, which is in some sense you can't deal with anyone until they've essentially not just gone through the crucifixion, but essentially established the New Jerusalem, is, I guess, now my current mode of talking about therapy. Um, and I mean, I found this nugget afterwards. I mean, in some sense, in this recording, I mean, I was kind of thinking about it, that essentially that my whole theme of my false ego complex is in some sense to envy the only begotten Son, which is in some sense not that sinful, because to envy the only begotten Son is very close to being, to wanting to like the only begotten Son, to being likeful of the only begotten Son, to be like, to want to be like the only begotten Son, to envy. So in some sense, envy is quite a useful. Envy is a very interesting vice, supposedly, because envy is the precursor to admiration, and admiration, to some degree, could even be used to define the core essence of love, admiralty, which also connotates to it the idea that we can be lumped together into a single understanding, that we can be of one mind, that we can share the condition of the mind, that we can share an understanding, is somewhat built into the word admiralty. And that is also what is the form of law that we are saddled with. We are saddled with the form of admiralty law, because we do not have sovereigns that are capable of living in a real republic. They are not yet at the level of being able to operate within the republic. They need to live under the sea of admiralty law, under the anchor of the law of the high seas, because that's, they're still sea creatures in the unconscious of the karmic fields. But in some sense, there are ways to escape the sea, In most Western liberal democratic societies, there are ways to sue for your sovereignty, or at least to protect it when it is under fire. When you are a true people, when you are a true um, sovereign people, and people as in the individual, people doesn't mean plural. People does not necessitate plural. A people can also be an individual. The people can also be an individual. But that's a grammatical claim that I'm making. But anyway, that's true by definition. So I mean, literally, it just takes one person to say it's not true by my definition, and then you've got a controversy. Um, and if you think that it's worth getting into an argument like that, then you really don't understand your own sovereignty. I mean, you might as well just pack up and say, well, we have an incommensurate, we have an impasse, and this is why we can't have nice things. No charity. Um, because some people don't operate from faith, they operate from you have to assimilate into them. Uh, and this is the problem, is that in some sense, when you do have the truth, you do want to be a holdout and say, well, I will not condescend to your level, because then I'm just going to crawl over broken glass so that I can prove to you that you're an idiot. And you don't even want to know that you're an idiot anyway. So what's the point? Why should I demonstrate to you your own idiocy so that then you can debase me even further and denigrate me even further? Because maybe I would even give you the ingredients to learn your lesson, and you still wouldn't learn your lesson by the demonstration that I would offer to you. So what is the point there? You know, the idea is that, oh, these people just haven't had enough demonstration. That's actually not the problem. The problem is not lack of demonstration, especially not when you're dealing with borderline. So some impasse is really not bad to have. This is the problem as well, is that, like, you know, when you're dealing with, let's say, the divine science, the divine ways of spiritual things, the hard question is, how do we deal with the world? How do we deal with worldly justice and worldly structures that I do want to reform? That I do want to make sure that the hard powers of the world are brought under heel. But in some sense, this is the problem, is that you can't, a judge can't say, well, actually, it's so complicated, this issue, so you're not wrong, but you're not right. And the other person isn't wrong, but he's also not right. Where do I draw the line? Because in some sense, I have to draw a line that in some sense says, well, actually, on balance, you need to bootstrap your problem here. And on balance, you need to bootstrap your problem here. But exactly where to draw that line is a bit finicky. It's a bit imprecise. And because I'm not allowed to, because if I can't draw it exactly precisely, am I just allowed to do nothing? Or can I somewhat split the difference in the vague grey area, in the gradation or whatever? Can I just split the difference? And in some sense, can I say, well, let's split the difference against each of you both ways. So I'll both contract both of your claims against each other and award to each other the bare minimum. So at least then you have a taste of justice, and the fullness of justice would have only come between you settling your controversy with some kind of conciliation. But this is the problem. This is the problem. Is that people don't want that form of justice. They don't want that cold form of justice. They want the self-indulgent form of justice. They want the punitive damages. They don't want the patrimonial damage claims being settled or arbitrated and adjudicated in a very justifiable way. They want more than justifiable justice. They want a justice that satiates their self-indulgence, which in some sense in America is exercised through the ballot box to some degree, although I do think that well, in some sense, there are also people that are quite valiant that use the ballot box to try to fight against those who are self-indulgent. So in some sense, there is very clearly in the American system a lesser evilism afoot quite often, or at least there's an argument to be hashed out about lesser evilism, and in some sense that argument is not a bad argument to have. That argument can, I think, in fact, be hashed out. And if there is a kind of grassroots, broad-based consensus about the route to take, I mean, this is, what famously the Tea Party tried to do. And, the Tea Party grew, in some sense, into Steve Bannon, and the Steve Bannon, in some sense, grew into Breitbart and into somewhat of a loose plan and a consensus, which grew into Trump. And Trump, in the wholeness of time, I think will be vindicated, even in quite medium-term history. And the hypocrisy of the left and the Democrats will start coming blaring through in the disgustingness of the mainstream media. And there's just, just the overt hypocrisy and deceptiveness and narrative control and, how Glenn Greenwald was treated because he wouldn't jump on the bandwagon and he wouldn't get on board with all the censorship against the Biden, the Hunter Biden articles and such and such. And all the kind of the weird sort of unsustainable COVID fear-mongering, which is in my view, frankly, unsustainable. When you understand enough about viruses in the round, you understand just how strangely hyperbolic all of this overreaction is, and how politically it seems to be designed. Anyway, and also the quite strange irregularities around the American voting system. All of these things compound to a very toxic concoction of some kind of constitutional crisis in the works, which is why I proselytize my particular update of the legal structure that I think America needs to take heed of. But anyway, that's a separate sort of issue. But I mean, I do just want to reform two things. I want to reform the field of psychology and the field of law. And in some sense, I mean, I call myself maybe an alchemist, a spiritual alchemist. And I do think that spiritual alchemy needs to get the field of psychology and the field of law underneath it, subjugated by it. I think alchemists need to give advices to people on those two grounds. And maybe as a third ephemeral sort of issue to get into would be education, as education needs to take some heed of psychological understandings, let's just say that. So anyway, that I think is how I will try to bring order to the world. That'll be my life's work, I guess. And that's quite a nice way to call it, I think, alchemy, because then at least you're not calling it religion, but essentially it is the study of many religions, perhaps, as well. But I mean, I guess I do use Christianity quite a lot, but I do see incredible threads of agreement. But sadly, I do think that the core spiritual mechanism is essentially delineated in its detail quite precisely by Christianity, although there are other threads that I'm still looking down. But I mean, I've studied a lot of different things. And I mean, I have taken from a lot of things. I mean, the 24 emotions that I use are from Buddhism. So they have 25 emotions, including happiness, but I don't include happiness in describing the karmic circuits. or the unconscious metagram emotional tone circuitry. The subtypes within metagram are basically Hindu, Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. So that's, and I agree with a lot of simplistic. There's a lot of simple spirituality which is very clearly delineated nicely in Hinduism. But I know there is this Kashmiri philosophy which is quite close to some of my Christian understanding. So I still need to study that probably a bit. The heart of Siva, or something like that. But I do think that some of that can be a little bit problematic. Because without a proper rubric, without a proper model of what you're dealing with, without a proper model of the territory, first of all you need a compass, but you also need a map. And in some sense I feel like a lot of things are old compasses, and in some sense the map has been lost, the context has been lost. But also the context always changes, because the whole epoch, the whole system is kind of leveling up, I think, even as it's degenerating into sin, because in some sense we needed a specialization of sin in order to garner more insight in the alchemy of integrating a more broad synthesis and integration of the problem, that in some sense without sin being properly manifest it can't be properly redeemed, is another way of putting it. It can't be reclaimed into the New Jerusalem. Okay, I've tired out my own voice and I've spoken on and on and on, so let me stop this finally.